Hello. That looks a bit lopsided. That's better. Hello, everybody. At some point I'll knock my flags down. Oh well, they'll have to wait for another time. Right, so, hello, how is everybody? Hopefully volume is okay. Apologies for the slight delay. I had a minor incident where it dispatched the Enterprise F and the Enterprise J to an early grave and had to find the bits. But don't worry, they're all back again. So, yeah. John Tech pointing out that yes, I have recently trimmed my beard and moustache down to their standard length, and then I'll let it grow out again over time. I do need to get a haircut though. It's getting a little bit long for my taste. Where is the Iron Brew? The Iron Brew is over there, kind of. It's down there in the Goblet of Fate. So, Alexander Justice, it is actually Boxing Day in the UK as well. The purpose of this stream was basically brought up to me by someone who emailed me and pointed out that basically, well, with the situation that we've got at the moment, with lockdown, etc., all over the world, then there's a lot of people out there who maybe would like to be somewhere with friends and family today, but aren't able to be. So, yeah, well, they said, well, do you mind doing a live stream so people have someone to talk to or listen to? I was like, oh, okay, I will do that then. The Patreon Dry Dock live stream will be coming to your screens this coming Friday evening. Well, Friday evening UK time. But, yeah, this is just kind of a general purpose live stream. I guess it's kind of over to you guys. What questions would you like to have answered? What would you like to talk about? And I'll just start picking up random questions as I see them. Timu Loka pointing out that yes, indeed, the Battle of the North Cape was today in 1943. Eva Harriman asks, will aircraft carriers still be relevant 30 years from now? Oh, that's a loaded question, isn't it? I think it's going to depend very much on how they evolve. My personal feeling is that carriers are getting a little bit too spread out in all directions, if you see what I mean. I think with the diversity of threats coming in nowadays, because you've got ballistic threats, you've got hypersonic threats, you've got subsonic threats, you've got high flying threats, low flying threats, torpedoes, etc., etc. There's so many different threats to a carrier, plus so many different roles for a carrier now, both defense and offense, that I think you're basically either looking at having to do a carrier with an awful lot more non-aircraft related systems, but still a useful air wing, which means you're going to have to go up to 150, 160 plus thousand tons of displacement, and there's really only two nations on the planet who can keep up with that particular game, or you are going to have to repurpose everything to be a little bit more specialist. So rather than at the moment where the carrier kind of does everything that's above 60 feet, and then you've got destroyers that are fulfilling the escort, anti-submarine, and land strike with missile role, I think you're going to have to divide up and go, right, these anti-aircraft defense ships, they're going to be fully loaded with anti-aircraft defense missiles. These are our ASW ships. These are probably going to be our automated pickets, and the carrier is going to be purely about strike aircraft and maybe AWACS. The ASW have to be moved off to something else to maximize the impact of the carrier. That's my personal opinion anyway. We'll see how that bit is borne out. Oh wow, everything is jumping massively questions wise. Yes, Night Heron Productions point correctly identifying that this is Achilles over here engaging Graf Spee, which can just about be seen right over there. Dun, dun, dun. Coltax 100 asks, what if the British do not build the King George V and instead modernised all the British battleships and battle cruisers? They would probably be in a worse off state than historically. Excuse me. Yeah, they'd probably be in a worse off state, mainly on account of speed. Because when it comes to enemy craft, whether that be Japanese, Italian, or German, they're going to be left with only Hood and Repulse and Renown as ships that are capable of catching up to or overhauling them, whilst having all the QEs and Barham and all the QEs and the R's and Nelson and Rodney being all modernised is all very well and good. Even if they completely overhaul their engines, etc., and they get maybe up to 25 knots, that's not going to be anywhere close to enough to catch the Littorios, Bismarcks, Scharnhorst, even Yamato. Whereas the King George V's, okay, they can't necessarily catch some of those ships, but they can come very, very much closer to it, and they've got much more modern armour protection and anti-aircraft schemes. So, yeah, it's probably not such a good idea. And also, more hulls, because they were going to scrap the R's, but when they finished the KGVs, they didn't, and so they had the R's and the KGVs. If they modernise everything, then they're starting war with 15 battleships and nothing more on the stocks, unless they go with the Lions. And as opposed to starting the war with 15 battleships and 5 more on the way. Newcrofter asks, what are the oddest superstitions of captains and admirals you've heard of? I've heard of one captain who seemed to have an obsession with walking around the deck, but they always had to walk around the deck in equal amounts clockwise and anti-clockwise, and they were sure that if they didn't, something horrible would happen to the ship. So if they were doing a tour of the ship, this was back in the age of sail, they'd start off on the port side, go up to the bow, come back round again, and then they'd have to turn around and do the whole thing again, or if they did 2 laps, they'd have to do 2 laps in reverse. And that was just their thing. It was a little bit odd, but yeah, maybe some form of OCD, I don't know. That kind of stuff probably wasn't diagnosed very well in those days. Alex McGonigal, yes, well, if you're listening while painting Warhammer figures, that's a good idea. Norsdormu 89, if you had to pick an epic sci-fi capital ship fight, who would you pick and who would win? I mean, if we're going by rule of cool, and we're going to somewhat ignore the tech difference and just go with like what would look really, really cool on screen, I would probably go with maybe an Imperial Star Destroyer, or actually more accurately an Imperial 2 class Star Destroyer, versus a Babylon 5 Omega class destroyer at full HD, like full or even 4K rendering. Because, like, look at Rogue One, look at how awesome the Star Destroyers look with their new digital model. And I mean, Rogue One generally, I really like it, mainly just because I get to see X-Wings and Corellian Corvettes and TIE Fighters and Star Destroyers doing their thing in glorious 4K definition. Now, for those of you like myself who are fans of Babylon 5, imagine what would happen if they took something like an Omega class destroyer and rebuilt it as a 4K model with all the systems it was supposed to have, the missile launcher arrays that were never shown on the TV show, etc., and then pit the two against each other. Yes, I know this. Obviously, in Babylon 5, the Omega class destroyer doesn't have shields, etc. But come on, if we're doing a massive epic sci-fi capital ship fight, then rule of cool has to apply. Alex McGonigal also asks, with your videos on the loss of hood, how does a bulbous bow affect the shape, or more importantly, the position of the bow wave along the ship? It would reduce it, and correspondingly it would reduce the trough. So exactly what effect it would have depend on the type of the bulbous bow and also on how fast the ship's going, but it would have a positive effect on the bow wave and the trough relative to the shape of the bow wave and trough as it was on hood in its original format. So whether or not that would be enough to save hood, that is a bit more of an open question. You'd also have to look at that point at what's happening with the rest of the hull, because in the hood refit, the planned hood refit, they were going to increase the beam by further bulging out the torpedo defense system. That alone would have affected the hull form and possibly affected the exact profile of the bow wave. I mean, it's very interesting developing that a little bit further when you look at the photos of hood operating at speed. Hood in the 1920s doesn't show quite as pronounced of a bow wave and trough arrangement. Once you look at hood post 1930, I think it's post 1931, when there's a minor sort of refit patch up addition of new systems which affects a few things to do with hydrodynamics, that's when you see this much more pronounced bow wave appearing. So clearly something happened that affected things there. Quite what it was probably bears a lot further research. But we'll have to see how that pans out in the future. Other Charles says, you've probably answered this 100 times, but why didn't Bismarck land at least a couple of substantial hits against King George V and Rodney? She didn't land any substantial hits against King George V because she was focusing on Rodney and was still doing so at the time that she got her fire control systems kiboshed by Rodney. As far as why she didn't land substantial hits on Rodney, she came very close. And this is one of the things. Gunnery Officer Schneider, poor chap, deserves a medal, really. He was an excellent gunnery officer. He knew what he was doing, and he was getting Bismarck's fire pretty close to Rodney. There was some splinter damage from salvos that landed close. It was just a little bit unfortunate for him that, one, Bismarck was kind of lurching and juddering all over the place, which didn't help, but also Rodney's captain was handling his ship more like an overgrown destroyer than a battleship, and he was chasing the salvos on the basis that, well, you fire a salvo, you miss, logically you then correct, and so the one place those shells are not going to land is where they landed immediately before. So his theory was, well, I will then go towards where that last salvo landed, and therefore the shells won't land there, so I know that they won't hit me. And it worked, at least long enough for Rodney to score its own hits, and then once it scored those initial hits that wiped out primary fire control and then started working over the turrets, it was just a matter of time at that point. Fleet of Oceans, listening while delivering pizza. Yep, well, I had pizza delivered earlier today, so that was fun. Steve Martinuson, I think, says, Happy Christmas and New Year, Jack. Thank you very much, and same to you. Give me 2 seconds, just going to duck out of view here. Just get some drink. I'll pull that back. Federico Violino, what do you think about the Slovetsky Soyuz class? Will you do a 5-minute guide about it, or have you already done it? I haven't done a 5-minute guide on the Slovetsky Soyuz yet. I will do at some point. As for what I think about it, it does get a little bit overblown in some places. On paper, it's a very capable design. In practice, Soviet industry had a lot of limitations that would have significantly curtailed its ability to be a combat effective unit compared to what the paperwork would suggest. So, yeah, I would... In a lot of ways, I'd almost treat it like the Tegethoff class. They have the capability to be very capable ships if they're built by someone who has the technology and the quality control to actually build them properly. I don't necessarily think the Russian shipyards at the time were that place. But this is one of the joys-perils of paper ship designs. They can look fantastically better than real-life ship designs because they haven't been through that final design stage in a lot of cases, and even if they haven't been through the we've actually built it, now we have to work out all the quirks phase, which is... that's what the trials voyages are for, and the shakedown voyage. Farron Katz asks, what do you think a 100,000 long-ton battleship would have looked like, especially considering Yamato was only 71,000 long tons? Impressive, worryingly so, but perhaps not necessarily that much larger than something like Yamato or Iowa. If you look at Iowa and Yamato, they're actually of similar length. In fact, if I remember correctly, I think the Iowa was actually slightly longer. The Yamato is actually much wider. And when you look at Montana as well, Montana is much wider. So, bearing in mind the square cube law, obviously increase linear dimension by one factor and you increase the cubic volume by a factor of 8. A 100,000 ton battleship probably isn't going to be substantially larger than an Iowa or a Yamato. I mean, if you look at the Nimitz class was well over 100,000 tons. Look at it compared to an Iowa, and bearing in mind, obviously, a Nimitz doesn't carry any heavy armour, which makes up a significant portion of a battleship's displacement, and you can see that despite almost double the displacement of an Iowa, dimensionally they're not actually that much greater in size. Of course, the flight deck is, but that flight deck's a whole other issue. Gottjäger asks, replacing the hangar and aircraft operating facilities with the King George V's with VLS cells in the latter half of the 80s. That would be an impressive feat. I would like to see them try, but I'm not necessarily sure they could accomplish it. I mean, taking out the gun turrets, you'd have the depth for it, but expanding the hull beyond that to accommodate a very large VLS array is somewhat questionable. I suppose it could be done given the quad turrets, but I'd have to look into it further. It certainly could be done in some manner, but weirdly enough, the magazine-fed twin-arm launchers are probably more likely to work in that case. Nosdormu89, have you read any of the Honor Harrington series, and what's your opinion on it? I haven't. I've only read the TV Tropes page, unfortunately. I need to get round to doing that at some point. The Dying Titan asks, what is the most absurd weapons proposal you wish was tested? Guns or torpedoes, etc.? Most absurd. Well, I mean, the 12-inch gun mounted on a submarine was actually legitimately tested, so there is that. As to anything else, there's so many crazy weapons. The nuclear shells for the Iowas would have been interesting to see. Shaka Coyle asks, have you any plans for making videos about the history of specific Navy bases? Yes, at some point. At some point I will. I mean, there's so many good naval bases, like Portsmouth and Chatham here. There's Norfolk in the US, Kiel in Germany, Bordeaux, Brest, Toulon in France, etc. There's a lot of interesting naval bases whose history should be told. It's just a matter of getting around to things. I was actually plotting out Wednesday videos for next year earlier today, and I think I've booked up almost to October next year just with stuff that I've already either planned or partly written the script for. Simon Bankston asks, if you could take the place of any naval admiral, who would it be for each era? Oh, that's a very long question. So, yeah, edited highlights. I think I'd probably I'd probably go after one of the admirals who was part of the English fleet fighting the Spanish Armada. Um, that's a fairly good bet of how to accomplish something without completely ruining the timeline. Um, who else could I go after? Maybe Calder. Give the Franco-Spanish fleet a bit more of a kicking before Trafalgar. Who else could I go for? I mean, I kind of want to replace Jellicoe at Jutland, not because Jellicoe did a bad job, but simply because obviously I know how it goes. I know where the Germans are going, so I could turn that to my advantage quite easily. Yeah. Or maybe Admiral Tryon as well. When I get round to covering the collision between Victoria and Camperdown, you'll probably see why. Um, but yeah, I could have a lot of angry shouting matches with various Royal Navy officers about actually following the spirit of instructions, not the letter. Delta V2 TLI says, glad you see you're a B5 fan. I am also very glad that I am. Hakon asks, how capable would battleship armour be against modern weapons? Ooh. Depends what modern weapons. I mean, against something like one of the ridiculous bus-sized Russian supersonic missiles, probably not that effective. But against the deck guns of most modern warships, hilariously effective because most of them are 4.5 or 5-inch guns. Yeah. Against subsonic missiles, again, it depends what kind. If you're talking about something like Exocet, Penguin, Harpoon, the various Russian, Chinese equivalents, if they're still the old school models that just fly straight into the side of the ship, the belt armor would probably actually do pretty well against them. If they're the newer models that do the kind of pop up over into the deck, the deck armor might still give them a decent bit of protection, but much less because obviously it's bypassing the belt protection. So, yeah, there is that. 2 seconds, just need to pop off screen again. There we go. John Hart, what's your favourite pre-dreadnought battleship and why? Also, any update on the Great Battle of the Thames Estuary 1894? I have spoken with someone about getting the Great Battle of the Thames Estuary 1894 painted up, or digitally at least done as a bit of artwork. So yeah, working on that. Main problem is shortlisting the ships that are going to take part, because it turns out basically every ironclad known to the Royal Navy was still in service in 1894 in some way, shape or form, and most of the French and Russian ones were as well. Shakar Coil, favourite Star Trek ship? Ambassador class, actually. That's what you can see. The Enterprise C is taking its spot this week over there. Yeah, I like the Ambassador class, and Andrew Probert's originally intended Ambassador class perhaps more so. I'm a little bit torn on that. I like the brute functionality of the Ambassador class. Ray W, where did we build most destroyers? I'm assuming you mean the UK. Thornycroft and Yarrow yards, respectively. They were kind of the destroyer specialists. Jake Hart, would you consider a Wednesday special on the St Nazier raid and or HMS Campbelltown? Do you think the raid was the best way to attack the dry dock as opposed to something like a torpedo attack or shelling? Definitely better than shelling. Almost certainly better than torpedo attack, given how strong those gates were. As for Wednesday special, yeah, certainly. It can join the very long list. In fact, I think it is on the list somewhere now already. Dying Titan. What would other nations' Yamato equivalent look like? For the US, the Montana. For the UK, they didn't really ever get around to designing something in the 1930s, 1940s that would be equivalent. The closest equivalent in terms of size and scale and armament would probably be either the N3s or the Incomparable, or maybe the ridiculous 100,000 tonner that they theoretically dreamed up as a battleship capable of resisting all threats in 1946. But yeah, I don't think that's really a plausible vessel. Junkbeck. I'm very glad. I'm very glad. He got a top score in a video essay, apparently inspired by my video, so very nice, thank you. New Crofter, were there any navies that built a treaty ship but kept turrets with bigger guns in stock for a refit in the event that war broke out? Yeah, the Japanese with the Megamis, if you can describe the Megamis as treaty ships. They were the only ones who actually pulled it off seriously. There were some other designs that gave some thought to it, but most people just concluded that it was a dumb idea. I mean, technically you could probably say the Scharnhorsts as well, but they didn't actually have the 15-inch in stock. The Japanese did. Fafix 666, has the Japanese Navy ever used any special camouflage aside of Haruna's Dazzle camo turrets at Kure, or have they stuck to a single colour all the way? In World War II they did have a couple of more than one colour camo patterns, but they weren't too common. Although that said, a lot of their grey ones were actually two different shades of grey in some cases. But it depends on the year, depends on the ship. And there was a lot of just standard all over grey as well. Nozdormu 89, is there a scenario where classic gun doctrines can come back in modern times? If electronic warfare systems overcome sensor systems, then in theory, yes. I mean, that's one of the I don't know if it's legends or canon now, but certainly in the Star Wars Expanded Universe, that was one of the explanations as to why you had all the ships in Star Wars fighting out at point blank range. That basically, yes, they had sensors that could target you half a solar system away, but everybody's electronic warfare knocked everything back to the point you're effectively shooting into visual range only. And so you have all these close-in knife fights, but I don't know what the canonicity of that explanation is anymore. Admiral Tiberius, alternate history question. 2 Montana and a Lion versus 3 Yamato. Overcast skies, low clouds with choppy seas are the weather. Ooh. If it's a late model Lion, the biggest displacement one, Lion 42 or maybe Lion 44. Plus 2 Montana, overcast skies, low clouds and choppy seas. That's going to be a close one. I'd be tempted to give it to the Allies because their fire control systems will not be troubled at all, but overcast skies and low cloud, it depends how low. Because cloud at 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet, Yamato's optical systems at the ranges that matter are probably going to function just fine. If by low cloud we mean drifting patches of drizzle, smudges of fog, that kind of stuff, that could make a significant difference. But I think in 1945, with their radar-guided fire control systems, the edge would definitely be with the Allies in that particular case. Especially because apart from anything else, they can just wait for nightfall and go in then. New Crofteros, were there any navies that built... that I've already answered that one. Oh, what's going on here? Renee Schkickbauer asks, I really enjoy your technical videos on topics like naval boilers, Mark 14, etc. Any plans for war in 2021? Yes. As I say, I've been planning out the videos for 2021, but bearing in mind that 2 Wednesday videos per month are chosen by the Patreons, that's just the ones I plan to make, and there are some technical ones in there. Of course, if the good people on Patreon vote for more technical subjects, then of course I will produce more technical subjects. Animal 16365 asks, how did battleships load ammunition and powder bags into their respective spaces in a battleship, and how did they remove them besides firing them? Also, could you do videos on other admirals like Hood or Rodney? Yeah, I'll do videos on other admirals once my series on Nelson is completed. So for those of you who've been waiting for Nelson Part 3 for quite a while, the reason that that's been taking quite a while is because I was and still am hopefully, planning to do that aboard HMS Victory, but of course with COVID and everything, getting in contact with them is a little bit difficult, with furlough schemes, etc. And even then, getting aboard social distancing, safety, filming, etc. aboard Victory is going to also be quite difficult. So we'll see how things develop on that front, but that is kind of my plan. We'll have to see how it goes. If we get towards, say, August next year and it's still not looking like anything's going to get better, then I'll have to come up with some alternate way of doing the Trafalgar video. But I would really, really like to be able to do it aboard Victory, and you'll see why if I manage to do so. Bob the Raptor and Joe asks, do you think USS Enterprise CV-6 could have been modified with steam catapults and angled deck and serve in Korea and Vietnam? In theory, yes. In practice, not so sure. She was very badly worn out by the end of World War II. In being a Yorktown class, she's significantly smaller than an Essex. Obviously, the Essexes show that you could do a refit to a ship of approximately that size. And to be honest, although it was a bit of a bodged job, Victorious's refit also shows you can fit steam catapults with an angled deck to a ship of the size of Enterprise. Whether or not that with the Yorktown class, yeah, theoretically you can, but yeah, with Enterprise's physical condition, she would probably basically have had to been stripped down and rebuilt almost entirely. So yeah, we'll see. Matt Clem, which admiral best typified a British tar? Oh, that's an interesting one. I know you have someone who's come up through the ranks. Probably Admiral Duncan, to be perfectly honest, given that, unlike most British admirals, who, if someone was insubordinate or didn't obey their orders, would either shout at them some more or order someone to do something about them, take them below or whatever, Admiral Duncan wasn't averse to just picking up recalcitrant subordinates by the neck and literally holding them over the side of the ship. So that's much more in line with a British tar, I would think, than most people. Going back to Animal 16365's question about loading ammunition and powder, it was very manual process. If you look for battleship reloading ammunition, you'll see most of the time it was just craned aboard and then trucked around on little trolleys and taken down into the ship, which was quite fun. Yeah, the health and safety implications for these days are probably quite horrifying, but their ships, shells, and charge is actually surprisingly stable. Cow to Face asks, 2 German ships from World War II and World War I that you would preserved as museum ships, and why? Scharnhorst and Derflinger, or possibly Seydlitz. I'm torn. I like the Derflinger more, but Seydlitz probably has a bit more of a story behind her. In the World War II period, Scharnhorst, because I like the Scharnhorst class, basically. Harold Grunditchen, I think. What Council of World War II ships, or just before World War II, would have been in service the longest for major nations? Ooh, not battleships. Probably for the Royal Navy, probably something like the Malta class carriers. Ooh, apart from the Malta class carriers, what else? See, the thing is, there weren't too many cancelled immediately before World War II outside of the big ships. And the battleships had a limited lifespan left on them anyway. That's a good question. I'll have to think about that one. Drop me a line via Discord or email, and I'll come back to you with a longer list. Captain York asks, in the Channel Dash video there was a reconnaissance photo that labelled the Scharnhorst battle cruisers. Why is this? Basically, everyone had their own ideas of what the Scharnhorsts were, depending on their capabilities. So, yeah. The Scharnhorsts quite often were classified as battle cruisers during the World War II period. Don't worry, it's not me. Nosdormu89 asks, if Hood had been refitted before the Battle of Denmark Strait, would she have survived and what would her future have looked like? If she had been refitted before Denmark Strait, she probably would have survived. That weakness in the that probably killed her probably still would have possibly been there. I mean, this is the thing. Without modelling everything in some kind of hydrodynamic modelling software, it's impossible to tell exactly what effect on the bow wave and trough it would have had. It might have been enough, it might not have been enough. Where Hood would have sat in the water relative to where she sat in the water pre-refit also might have changed. That might have been good or bad. If she'd been able to make her full speed, she wouldn't have been in that precise location anyway. So, in as much as it's something of a 1 in a million shot, yes, she probably would have survived that salvo. In as much as whether or not she could still have been killed by a shell landing aiming for that kind of exact position, a bit more on the fence, since I don't think there's sufficient data there. Maxwell Looney asks, Drakenifel, I've heard about the P-class that Germany planned, a Hippo with 4 666-inch turrets, basically. Yeah, in World of Warships, the Mainz. Who would win in a 3-way fight between it, Belfast, and Cleveland in good and bad seas? Depends on the time period. The more you go into the war, the more I would give it to one of the Allied ships. Especially Cleveland. But with a heavy cruiser, with the Hippo class's hull and heavy cruiser protection, given just how big that blasted thing was compared to treaty era ships, a Hippo with 4 666 or more like 4 555.9s does have certain advantages in terms of durability and staying power. Whether it would, I think it would basically be a very, very close call in those cases of who can hit first and keep hitting, because as was demonstrated by an awful lot of battles, there would be I think it would probably be more down to who takes out the other's radar or fire control systems first with 6-inch fire, rather than any massive critical hits. SciFi 1970 was there never been any catamaran-style aircraft carrier. Pretty much the same reason there's never been any other catamaran-style large capital ship. There simply isn't the hull depth for the systems and the magazines and storage that's necessary. In the case of an aircraft carrier, you could get a massive flight deck with an aircraft carrier, and if you made that over deck deep enough, you could get a massive hangar on a catamaran aircraft carrier, but you'd never get the fuel storage, the ammunition storage, crew storage, the crew accommodation, the engines to get it to actually go anywhere for any great length of time or any great distance. Jacob Moss, Hydrax, supposing War of the Worlds had actually happened and some of the Royal Navy had been sunk, would other powers have put in efforts to overtake them? 2 seconds. Right, would anyone have tried to overtake them? Almost certainly. There would have been, France, Russia, maybe Germany, depending on the exact year, maybe even the US, would have made efforts to overtake them. Quite how successful they would have been depends on your interpretation of what happens post-War of the Worlds. A lot of interpretations, including some hints in the actual book, talk about taking up Martian technology, and if they are taking up Martian technology, then you've got quite the situation going on with the Royal Navy coming back with heat rays and black smoke and all sorts of things like that. Interesting. Oh, that's okay. Right. Galdir Ionai asks, in World of Warships, what would you consider to be the absolute worst case of paper ship bias? For some of the reasons I alluded to in the Slovetsky Soyuz question, some of the Russian ones purely because they function, as I said, like they would on paper. And if there's one nation of all the big naval building nations in World War II where what was achieved in reality and what's theoretically possible on paper differentiate the most, it's the Russians. So yeah, the bigger Russian ships, I think. I mean, the thing is that World War One, things like the Ganguts weren't half bad. They had their strengths and weaknesses, but they weren't half bad ships. They had some very nice guns. But World War Two, when you get up into the bigger super ships, turns out sending most of your competent ship designers to Gulag and shooting with many of those who remain doesn't really do that well for your naval shipbuilding industry. Sam726627. Just thank you for amazing content. Thank you very much, Sam. That's a nice personal message. Samuel Thompson. I notice you haven't covered many major battles or events. I'm curious if you prefer small details or simply want to take your time on them. There are a number of major battles and events on the channel under various things. I really must make a better playlist for the Wednesday videos. But they do take a lot of time to research. I mean, something like even the Battle of the Final Voyage of Bismarck, where you've got two relatively small battles, involves a fantastic amount of research. Jutland took me well over a year and a half to put the script together for the three-parter. I mean, okay, fair enough, Jutland's at the bigger end of things, but still, once battles go over more than 2 or 3 ships per side, things get so ridiculously complicated that unless you can address things on a squadron level, it just becomes stupidly complex, and it takes a lot of time to put something acceptable together. New Crofter asks, Tumble Home hull offered stability. Could the design have stayed more relevant and allowed for super firing turrets? Theoretically, yes, but you can get super firing turrets with the normal hull design. Witness the Didos and the Atlantas and some theoretical designs that went even further. The big problem with Tumble Homes when you're in the era of super firing turrets is there's so much heavy shells coming towards you. You would lose stability so hilariously quickly if you got hit that would be a stupendously bad idea. Matt Clem, do you know who the inspiration was for Sir Joseph from HBS Pinafore? Not off the top of my head. Orchestra, opera, musicals, not my strongest suit, unfortunately. Yeah, going back to the Tumble Home question. Yeah, you in theory could have this ridiculously top-heavy design with a Tumble Home hull, but the minute you got hit, bad things happen. Renee Shikbar, I think, asks, how long did it take to repaint a World War One or World War Two warship, like applying a different camouflage pattern? Depends if you're in dry dock or at sea. It could be a day, it could be several days, it could be a week plus. Depends how complex you're doing it. If you're just slathering the whole thing in an extra layer of battleship grey, that's going to go a lot quicker than if you're trying to do some kind of complex 3 or 4 colour camo scheme. Getting some of the really complex camo schemes done while at sea is really not going to happen. Touching them up maybe, but the actual schemes themselves are generally probably a dockyard job. Edward Olson, during the period from the US Forgotten Fleet, from the 6 frigates to the Civil War, what do you think the Navy would have done if Congress had doubled the budget? Probably kept the majority of their ships of the line in service instead of basically turning them into a series of glorified accommodation hulks, and maybe even modernising them with screw propellers and steam engines when the time came. Probably a lot more frigates as well, to be perfectly honest. Sorry, I'm just topping up the glass. There we go. The goblet of power is back. Inyo, on the subject of films, which film does a remarkable job depicting naval combat and operations, whilst on the other end, which films are egregious depictions? As a rule, not necessarily, it definitely not a 100% rule, but as a general guideline, the closer to the time period that the film is made, especially when it comes to World War II style films, the more accurate they get, often because they have either actual naval officers or in some cases the actual officers who are in those particular engagements either advising or part of the film, and often have access to real warships. Whereas as things go forward, spectacle seems to be more predominant and more important to certain directors as compared to actual reality. So, yeah. I mean, if you look at something like the Battle of the River Plate, yes, I know there's a US Des Moines-class cruiser playing the role of Graf Spee, so it looks completely out of place. But if you look at things like that, or Sink the Bismarck, the actual portrayals of naval officers and how they go about things, etc., are far more accurate than you'll see in a lot of films these days. But there are a few films these days that do actually represent those things a lot better. And actually one of the things that has improved, in at least for certain films, has been the depiction of the Age of Sail and other much older eras. Master and Commander, for example, Master and Commander is a very good film for a naval enthusiast generally, but it's also pretty good at its depiction of naval combat in the Age of Sail. Certainly a lot better than a lot of other films of the last 20 or so years that depict Age of Sail combat of some description. Jacob Moss, hey Jack, have you read the book Spacecraft of the First World War? It's a very interesting read on naval astral warships post-War of the Worlds. It rings a bell, but I can't say that I have. I almost think that I have. I'm almost certain I've got a copy of that somewhere, or I've read a copy, but I can't for the life of me remember if that's accurate or not. I need to look that up at some point. Black Steel Balls, what are your top 3 museum ships that you would recommend visiting? Well, bear in mind I have a relatively limited number of museum ships that I've actually seen. So, I mean, I can't, like, for example, I can't give a recommendation for something like Bliskovica or Georgios Avarov or any museum ship in the United States, with the exception of the USS Intrepid, because I haven't been to them yet. I've been to a fair number of the ones in the UK and a couple of others overseas, but from the ones that I've visited, I would probably say Portsmouth Dockyard, because it's a one-ticket thing, so you get to see Warrior, Victory, M33, the Monitor, whatever bits of the Royal Navy are in dock at the time, etc. Mary Rose is there as well. So that would definitely be probably number 1 on my list. After having been to Sweden, the Vasa Museum, oh my goodness, you have to see that. There are a few times I've gone into any kind of museum and say I had my breath taken away, but the first time I saw Vasa in its hall definitely counts. As a third, again, from my experience so far, probably SS Great Britain in Bristol, because that's very, very well preserved. Albeit, I'd say that's probably tying very closely with the Den Helder Museum in the Netherlands. Again, partially because they've got numbers of ships there, and partially because the state of preservation of those ships is also excellent. Dom Hen, what would have happened if it was USS Pennsylvania that encountered the Virginia instead of a frigate, and could she have been converted? Hang on, I just need to copy a couple of questions because they're getting out of hand. It would depend what Pennsylvania was armed with at the time. Yeah, it would depend what Pennsylvania was equipped with. If it was still equipped with its original 32-pounder armament, then probably bad things would happen for Pennsylvania, because sheer amount of firepower, sheer numbers of shots probably wouldn't actually make a tremendous amount of difference. If it had been re-equipped or modified in some way with some kind of significantly more powerful weaponry, maybe parrot rifles or Dahlgrens or something like that, then I mean, sheer a weight of shot could have had a very telling effect on Virginia. But yeah, it would depend an awful lot on what kind of weaponry it had been given. I mean, apart from anything, at its sheer size, given the fact that Virginia was hardly the world's most agile ship, simply running it down would have been an option at that point. The Shipyard says, "Hey mate, hope you had a good Christmas. Fancy doing live dry dock with a guest next year?" Sure, why not? If we can somehow make that work. I've only ever done live streams with just me, so I have no idea how that would actually work. But there we go. Right. Right, I've lost the names for a couple of these people. Oh, 2 seconds. I've lost the names for a couple of these people, so I do apologise, but I was trying to grab your questions before they ran out. No, I want to open a text document. I don't want to open World of Warships just at the minute. Thank you. Let's get that. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. Move that over there. There we go. Now I shouldn't miss anything. Hopefully. Anyway. Right, so I'm going to pick a few more questions up. How are we doing time-wise? Oh, we're just about an hour in, so... William Barnett, can you address the pros and cons of the monocle and top hat? The monocle is an absolute pain. To be perfectly honest, to keep in place. Although it looks very snazzy, it is just an absolute pig. The top hat, on the other hand, is quite good unless you happen to be going through a low door frame. One of my side projects at some point, that I must complete at some point, is actually what I call a hat of the line. Basically, I've got a bunch of scale model brass cannon about 2-3 inches long. And my plan was to get a cheap top hat, cut little gun ports in it, and basically make a top hat with a 3-tier gun deck and a foremast, bowsprit, and a little bit of rigging, and just go around with that. But it's one of those many projects that I've started and not had the time to finish. Samuel Thompson says, "I know you hate post-1950, but do you think railguns could make battleships or cruisers relevant again?" I think they could, yes. As for how, I would recommend going and having a look at the Bilge Pumps podcast on the SimSec website that I do with Armoured Carriers and Dr. Clark. I've discussed it in a lot more detail than I'd be able to discuss it on here. But basically the short version is, if you could use railguns as a kind of first stage booster for missiles, basically firing the missile up into the upper atmosphere where the air is thinner, then gun ships, if you like, could make a comeback. Thomas Sedgman, what were the diagonal pipes on World War I battleships? I think that's the question I've seen the most across the channel. They're torpedo net booms folded in. Sreko Kuvalo, how's life? Pretty good at the moment, actually. watching the hilariously grinding process of bureaucracy as they as it grinds on in its inevitable in the council's inevitable attempts to get, well, not attempt, successful nature of getting rid of me. But yeah, bureaucracy is a wonderful thing when they're just like, they send you an email at the beginning of December saying, yep, your position has been deleted, but it's going to take us several weeks over Christmas to actually sort out any of the bureaucracy for it before we can give you a P45. It's fun, but hey, that's this is the end of week 1 of 3 weeks of leave that I've taken because, hey, I've got the leave and it's not like I'm going to be using it a week or two, a month or two down the line, so might as well use it now. Fickle Finger of Fate, what would have been the impact of the Walther subs if the Germans had deployed them a year earlier? Depends on what numbers and if they still have the problems that they did historically. 1 or 2 or half a dozen a year earlier with all the problems that they had on deployment historically, not going to make a huge difference. If somehow magically they're all working and end up with all sorts of things going on with them, like if they're all working and they end up, like, I don't know, 1-for-1 substituting for all the U-boats the Germans are building, then might have a more significant impact. But to be honest, at that point, the bigger impact is the fact they've lost a lot of their experienced crews. So I think that more than anything is going to be the big problem that they're going to face. But there you go. Oh yeah, just in case you're interested in what I've been wandering around with in my left hand, I have a Tyrannosaurus Pez. So Pez dispensers are great. Andrus Person asks, I'd be up for some more about the steampunk fantasy ship game Dystopian Wars. That was from the Fun Friday. Yeah, if people want to see more about that, I'm happy to do that. You probably saw from the start of that video, I have quite the collection. And with the game kind of coming out in a version 2.0 form, yeah, it'd be interesting. But as I've said repeatedly on the channel, this channel is about naval history. I might occasionally visit Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts, World of Warships War Thunder, Dystopian Wars, Victory at Sea, Black Seas, Warlord Games, other one, the Age of Sail one. I might occasionally visit those and all sorts of other naval related games and other subjects on the occasional Fun Fridays, but I don't want this channel to become a kind of, well, it used to be about naval history, now it's just about things Drac does generally. So the Fun Fridays will be the occasional thing, not a regular weekly feature, and they'll still stay naval related. So yeah, we'll have to see how that goes. But if people want to see more about Dystopian Wars, I'm quite happy to cover it on a limited basis. Copying in over a few more questions. Questions copied, we can continue. Survival Test 370, can you talk about ship design and building processes in the Age of Sail? I could, but to be perfectly honest, I would probably, I probably could talk fairly extensively about that, but for some of the finer details, I do know of a couple of naval historians who specialise in that field that I would probably bring on for a kind of one of the more interview style Wednesday videos that I've done previously to talk about that. I do have something like that in the works at some point. Random guy. What, in your opinion, was the closest fought major battle of post-wooden era of warships? Oh. Closest fought. Repair ship can chapter saying, do you see torpedo boats? There are some upstairs. Closest fought major battle. I mean, the Battle of the Komandorski Islands is very close. Poor old USS Salt Lake City really took a pounding there. That was a very, very close call as a battle. The thing is, most major battles really do go rather decisively one way or the other. Relatively quickly, thanks to the power of explosive shells. Yeah, I'm just thinking like Dogger Bank's pretty decisive. Coronel, even the Guadalcanal battles generally. Maybe the naval night battle of Guadalcanal. And that's mostly closely fought only in as much as South Dakota suddenly went dark and lost power. Otherwise, and therefore was at risk. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be that much. And it turned out to be fairly decisive anyway. Jade of Arc, thank you very much for the message. And yes, hopefully we will all stay safe in these times. We'll just have to see how times work out here. There's another question copied over. And get rid of that. I have no time for conspiracy theories. Grimtooth asks, how is your Tech Priest doing in Dark Heresy and what version does your group use? We actually use Dark Heresy 1.0 rules. Tech Priest is still alive, only just. A lot of people in the RPG questioning quite how he is still alive. But good old Drakon Beta 7 is functional, flying, and surrounded by many mechadendrites and servo skulls, which is something that he finds most gratifying, although he does get shot a disturbing amount of the time. Yeah, at some point I need to find a 40k artist and commission some artwork of good old Drakon Beta, because he is quite the hilarious character. I think he's given himself PTSD from poking all the shinies and constantly provoking nearly end-time horrors. But then again, end-time horrors in 40k are kind of Tuesdays, so... Christopher says, assuming Hood survived World War II, got an Iowa-style refit and was Task Force flagship of the Falklands War, how do you see it going? Iowa-style refit, so we're talking about cruise missiles, harpoons, CIWS. Most of the Iowa refit is not actually that useful for the Falklands conflict, because you're not going to... I mean, I suppose you could launch cruise missiles at Stanley Airfield instead of using Vulcans. But the Argentine Navy never gets close enough to use the harpoons. What else could we have? The CRWS would be very useful, but to be perfectly honest, having radar-guided 40mm of some description will probably be the single biggest contribution. I mean, the guns, the big guns, the main guns themselves would be very useful for shooting at Argentine troops to make them surrender or go away. But I think the main impact, given the impact that the two Bofors on Fearless had on Argentine aircraft, if you have a battleship that somehow managed to retain a substantial number of incoming of sort of quad or sextuple 40 mils, and you can position that in San Carlos water, that's going to have some very, very bad news for most of the very low-flying Argentine aircraft, because then they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. They either fly very low and get ridiculous numbers of 5.25s or more likely 4.5s plus 40 mils shooting at them, or they go high to avoid that, and they end up in the sights of the various radar-guided Seawolf, Seacat, Sea Dart missiles that are around. Ben Arnold, when does the torpedo boat begin and end to be a legitimate threat in both reality and in the minds of naval doctrine? Well, it begins with its invention, at least in the minds of the people who invented it. As far as whether or not it was an actual threat, I think with the advent of massed secondary batteries and the hilariously short range of torpedoes at the time, I don't think they really came into their own as a full-on legitimate threat until probably around about just before the First World War. I mean, you look at the number of torpedo boats that were around in, say, the Russo-Japanese War, actually around, and they didn't really accomplish all that much. But yeah, I'd say probably the two world wars in the interwar period, that's when the torpedo boat, or at least what it was by that point, was a legitimate threat, albeit that the torpedo boat of World War II is significantly larger than most destroyers would have been in World War One. Sig recommends Alabama. Yes, Alabama is on my shortlist for places to visit in the US, as dash when I'm actually able to make it to the US. Connor Dudman, had the Royal Navy been allowed to build two N3s and two G3s, what would the US Navy and Japanese Navy be permitted to build as a counter, and what would subsequent treaty battleships look like? That would depend. I'm taking it you mean instead of Nelson. Let me think. If the Royal Navy had been allowed to build two N3s and two G3s, the US would have demanded at least two South Dakotas for the G3s. The Japanese would have demanded the two Tosas instead, again, in exchange. The Japanese probably would have also demanded two of the Akagi class. So yeah, so the Japanese would have been two Tosas and two Akagis. With the US, I don't know, they might have wanted to complete the entire Colorado class or gone for Lexingtons. That's a bit more of a difficult one. Valet U says no Belfast on my top 3 list. Belfast is definitely up there. I really do like it. The thing is, Vaasa is just a thing in and of itself, so it has to be up there. Portsmouth has so many ships, apart from anything else. Yeah, the thing is, when it comes to the third spot, once you've gone past Vassar and Portsmouth, there are a load of really good ships that could compete for third spot. Belfast definitely could be up there for a third place. It's one of those things. Well, most museum ships are kept in good enough condition, at least the ones that I've been to. That it becomes very difficult basically to decide at that point. Going back to the N3G3 question, subsequent treaty battleships, well, they'd have to be around about 45,000 ton limit and probably 18-inch gun if the N3s are going to be around. About the only thing the Royal Navy might try and counter-argue is that the US Navy and the Japanese have the Colorados and the Nagatos already building, so they've already got 16-inch ships. So they might try and argue that if they get the 2 N3s and the 2 G3s, but they don't get Nelson and Rodney, that maybe then the US gets the full Colorado class and the South Dakotas, and the Japanese get the Tulsas, and that's it. Well, along with the Nagatos. Whether or not they'd win that argument is an entirely different matter. Where are we going? Jeremax says Błyskawicz's main tour includes going through the boiler. Oh, right. Well, I've definitely got to get to Poland when everything calms down. Colette Noir. After your Hood video, I got the Bismarck book. It's superb. Are there any equivalent books for vessels in the Age of Sail? Oh, I mean, that book, Battleship Bismarck by Dueling-Garski and Durans, is a very high bar to clear, to be honest. Equivalent books for the Age of Sail. I'm just looking over at my Age of Sail shelf and trying to work out. Yeah, there's one by John McKay called Sovereign of the Seas, and no prizes for guessing what ship that's about. There's also one called Your Noblest Ship, spelt old school style, like SHIPPE, and I think Noblest is spelt with too many T's as well, which is about the Mary Rose. Those are two that I've got and read that are similar, although they're not quite as substantial as the Bismarck book. They certainly come close. And they're very good for covering specific vessels in the Age of Sail. I'm pretty sure there's probably others. I'm sure someone's written a equivalent sized book on the USS Constitution, and if they haven't, that's a huge market niche that someone's missed. But I haven't come across it as of yet. So we'd have to see. Jay Grocott, have you read or heard of the Destroyman books by Taylor Anderson? Yes, I have. Haven't read them, but I've seen them. I keep seeing them in Forbidden Planet in the alternate history section when I pop down there. Life Pill says, could not fit a 971 word question regarding hospital ships and replacement thereof into 200 words, so I sent you an email instead. Okay, I'll have a look for that when it comes in. Mark says, not book video, sorry. Oh, okay, so there's two separate questions there. Mark's asking, have you done or would you be interested in doing a book on the evolution of naval radio usage? The huge collection of aerial strung from the masts on Hood's photos were impressive. So that's what you mean. So a video on naval radio. Yeah, at some point. Add it to the exceptionally long list of things to do. Yeah, there's so many. This is the joy of naval history. There's so many things to talk about. Although I'm pretty sure there's a couple of specialists in electronic communication who probably want to come in on that that I can think of. Coltax 100. Could the British build Lion and Temeraire instead of Vanguard, but commission during World War II to reinforce the fleet, and how would it change the war if it happened? They could. They could have got them in service a lot sooner than Vanguard. They could have got Vanguard in service a lot sooner than they historically did as well. Depends on their wartime priorities. the main hold-up was the 16-inch guns. The 16-inch guns meant you wouldn't get them in before 1943, and to be perfectly honest, by 1943, about the most impressive thing they're probably going to do is maybe substitute for Duke of York and shoot up the Scharnhorst, which you don't really need a Lion Glass to do. Yeah, most of the big impressive battleship actions that they could have been used for all took place in the earlier part of World War II. I mean, they would have been great in the Mediterranean, or indeed in the Hunt for Bismarck, but there was no way you were going to finish them by 41. You might finish, if they weren't the delays with the 16-inch guns, you might have finished them by the end of 42, which, yeah, if you finish them by the end, by mid to late 42, you might get a few fights in against the Italians. And you might be able to deploy them up against Japan a little bit sooner, but yeah, unfortunately they're one of those things where, realistically speaking, they're not going to be finished in time to do all that much of anything. Curium 96, what would have happened if the Germans had captured Richelieu? Probably not an awful lot. Assuming the French didn't sabotage it, which they might well have done. The Germans had enough problems keeping their existing fleet fueled and crewed, especially fueled. So an entire new logistics train for Richelieu, plus its fuel requirements. They might give it a go, trying to sail it out from obviously French Atlantic ports into the Atlantic, but I don't think it would do more than a voyage or two before it either got shot to pieces or they just decide it's not worth it. Rambling Rattlesnake, can you please make a video about the Type 21 U-boat? Yep, in time. It's just a matter of when. I think there is one still around in Germany as well. So ideally, where example of a ship still exists, ideally I'd want to go to there and look at the ship and video the ship and then do the video including that. But we just have to see. Temu Loca, dry dock with Jingles. What, you think Jingles doesn't suffer enough having to put up with me every month with Armchair Admirals? If he's willing to, sure. He'd certainly be a much better place to answer questions about slightly more modern navies, especially obviously for obvious reasons the Royal Navy, than I would be. If you want to inflict that on Jingles, then feel free to suggest it to him. Poor chap. Copying more questions across. There we go. Foop. Drakenefeld is your favourite warship class of all time. Oh. So if you ask me favourite ship, favourite warship, that's an easy one. Favourite warship class, then I'm torn between aesthetics, accomplishments, and potential. See, if I was going to go for accomplishments, I would go with the Queen Elizabeth class. If I was going to go for Queen Elizabeth and Fletcher class on accomplishments would be a tie. If I was going to go for aesthetics, as a class, assuming by a class we mean more a ship that has at least a sister ship, I'd be torn between the New Mexicos and the Renowns. I have a real soft spot for the aesthetics of the New Mexico class. Potential. There's so many ships that have really good potential. I don't think I could give an answer on that one there. Archangel Glenn, assuming all things were equal, which of the proposed ships would win in a fight between Lion, Montana, and Shinano? Assuming all things were equal, I mean, in terms of crew, fire control, weather conditions, and everything, in theory, Shinano, because of its just ridiculous armour, Okay, the overall quality may not necessarily be as brilliant, but I mean, if Shinano is able to just get range and start hitting with those ridiculous 18-inch shells, it's going to have an advantage over, say, a Lion 42 model. With a Montana, that's a little bit more questionable. But an individual 18-inch shell hit that penetrates from a Yamato, or Shinano in this case, is going to do more damage than an individual 16-inch 50 shell from Montana. It'll be a hell of a fight, and neither side is going to come out looking particularly great for it. But yeah, everything else being equal, Shinano's just bigger and very heavily armed. But that's why the US and the UK developed things like radar, to make sure things would not be equal. 99 Iron Duke, best film about the Royal Navy in World War II. Oh. I don't know. There's so many. There are a lot of good films. A lot of them older films about the Royal Navy in World War II. I generally wouldn't be able to pick one. Drop me an email or a Discord message, and I could give you a short list though. Amid Razik, since you're a sci-fi fan, have you ever watched or heard of Gundam? Heard of? Yes. Watched? No. I don't have that many hours in my day. Galda, you and I, regarding collabs, any possibility you could do one with the Time Ghost crew? Midway's going to come up next summer. Sure. Quite happy to do that. Generally speaking, I'm quite happy to do crossover events with most people who work in this kind of field. And at some point, I've actually got to find historiographs' contact details so I could talk to him, because I mentioned in we were talking in one of his videos about, in the comments section, about doing a collab, and then I forgot that I needed to contact him for about a week, and then once I decided I should probably contact him, for whatever reason I couldn't find how to. So yeah, if anyone knows what his contact details are, shoot me a line, and I will. I'll get in contact with him about that. Guy has far more animating skills than I will have. Dr. Yoda, will you ever be doing a third part of the Horatio Nelson series? Yeah, I answered that already earlier on in here. Dun, dun, dun. Smash his face on keyboard says, how big could you make a torpedo, or would make a torpedoes be effective or practical? At some point you cross the line with torpedoes getting bigger and bigger from torpedo to small kamikaze warship. I mean, technically HMS Campbelltown was a big torpedo, just one that happened to have people aboard, which, to be honest, the Japanese Kai-10 torpedoes showed that you don't necessarily have to be very big to have people aboard their torpedoes. Alexander Justice asks, what turreted metal-hulled ship could you take furthest back in time, and what navy would you take it back to fight for? Oh, not many, to be perfectly honest, because pretty much all the turreted ships also involve steam engines, and the maintenance of the steam engines would become a major problem, although there are a bunch of early ironclads that are both steam and sail powered, so in theory you could just ditch the engines when they break down and operate purely on sail, but it would have to be a relatively early vessel that's still using basic solid shot and manually controlled turrets. So yeah, probably something from the 1860s. I mean, technically, oldest you could take back would be Gloire or Warrior without their engines, still perfectly viable as sail vessels. You could take them back quite far, but they're not turreted. So early turret ships, something like HMS Monarch, for example. Yeah, something like Monarch you could take back. Something like Monitor you couldn't, because you have no alternate propulsion method. Okay, a few more questions. Are we doing 8:30? So I'll run till around about 9. I've got a bunch of questions that people have asked that I've copied out. So at some point we'll get to a point where I have to run through those, and I won't be able to take further questions from the chat. Otherwise, we'd be here forever and a day, which may not necessarily be a bad thing. Except I'll run out. My voice will run out, and I've got to make some further headway into recording the Patreon dry dock tomorrow. So I do want to be able to speak at that point. Kaiju Director says, I'm in the process of writing an epic sci-fi naval saga. How would you feel if I named a character after you? Go for it. Just send me a link to it at some point when you finish writing it. And don't make me too stupid. Making me do crazy and eccentric things, not a problem. Just don't make me too dumb. And also, if you're going to kill me, make it spectacular. In the book, obviously. Try not to kill me in real life. I would rather resent that. Where have we got? Diamond Ginsu, why did you groom your beard but not your eyebrows? Because my beard is something that needs to be groomed. My eyebrows do their own things. They just are. I'm not into this kind of very, very fine dialed personal grooming. The beard gets shaved back to a certain length, and a very slight style. The hair literally just gets either a number 4 or a number 6 all over. That's it. Okay, that's as far as personal grooming hair-wise goes. Palle Rasmussen says, if you want a good guest, John Partial is a very nice guy, and I think he could be talked into guesting with you. Yeah, if you can persuade him to do so. I think there are a few very obvious fields of study that he's worked on that would be excellent for that kind of interview. Yeah, if you can, then that would be fantastic. David Will 286 asks redheads or brunettes. I'm married to one of those hair colours, so of course I have to answer that one. Oh dear. Jake Millar, French fleet at Mersel could be versus the British force. What if all the French ships had gotten out of the harbour without hitting mines and fought the British? That would have been a rather interesting fight, because the French outnumber the British, which would give them a theoretical advantage on paper, but if they're all sticking together, they're at a speed disadvantage, because they've got the Britannias with them, and overall their individual ships' firepower is less. So that would be a very interesting matchup, I think. See, Dunkirk and Strasbourg could actually do some serious damage, but are also the least protected of anything that's there. And, well, if you look at what happened to Britannia historically in harbour, you can see what happens to an effectively unupgraded World War I first generation super dreadnought when it fights anything that's had any degree of modernisation. Yeah, that's... I'd have to look at that in more detail, to be perfectly honest, because with the numbers, in theory, that's a big tick in the box of advantages for the French, because they'll have more ships that can engage than the British can counter-engage. But it would basically be a match of, can the French make their numbers advantage turn into hits that can degrade the effectiveness of the British force quickly enough before the British start knocking off some of the older ships, and then, or even knock off some of the newer ships and then turn their guns on the remaining ships, plus the wild card of what is Ark Royal doing. That's going to be that would be an interesting one to actually look at. Tent, have you got any comment on the Flower class? Yes, I did a 5-minute guide on them. And at some point when I get around to doing a commentary on Johnny Walker, there'll be the captain, not the drink, then there'll be a lot more to say about them. Yep, Cronus, that's the Bilge Pumps episode. Ryan Stradmeyer, Mayor, I think, asks, what would the Royal Navy have done if Hood was unavailable to intercept Bismarck? What ship would they have put in its place at King George V, which historically stayed back? My contention, to be perfectly honest, is that if there's any one big mistake you can point to in the whole chasing down of the Bismarck saga, it's the fact that Tovey kept King George V and Victorious back in port. He had his reasons, and okay, maybe it's a little bit of hindsight talking, but personally, why have a fair fight if you can have an unfair fight? Yeah, he was somewhat worried about what the Scharnhorst might do or what Tirpitz might do, but I mean, yeah, if I was put in Tovey's shoes, regardless of hindsight, I would have just taken King George V, Prince of Wales, Hood and Victorious and just toodled on up to the Denmark Strait with overwhelming force. Because if I can, why not? Someone asked about rocket-powered torpedoes, and yep, was pointed out, yeah, there are rocket-powered torpedoes. The Russians invented some. Patrick Stacey, assume World War I breaks out 2 years later, but otherwise proceeds as usual. How does the monstrous French building program interrupted by World War I affect the Washington Treaty equivalent? Probably not all that much, to be honest, because if they built the Normandies and the battle cruiser equivalents that they were thinking about building, and maybe even had a good start on the Leons, the French would probably be quite happy to just drop the Britannias and the Corbett's and just keep the more modern ships, because Normandy and Leon classes are contemporaneous roughly with maybe not, well, the Leons are probably maybe a step ahead of something like Queen Elizabeth in terms of sheer brute firepower, but the Normandies are certainly on a par. So yeah, they'd probably just be kept instead of the older ships. I don't think it would overall affect the Washington Treaty all that much. It would just change a few names on the list of ships that France can keep. Scooter JSP, have the plans for a D&D game with the World of Warship folks progressed any? Will you post it on YouTube, as I'm sure it'll be epic? I think someone volunteered a bunch of rules, but it's still a work in progress, I think. Train King use HMS Belfast to deal with all the bureaucracy. No, I mean, I normally hate bureaucracy, but to be honest, watching the bureaucracy fall over itself, tangle itself up, and then fall into heavy machinery, mangle itself further, and then crawl out and desperately still try and do what it's supposedly originally supposed to be doing, is kind of funny, to be perfectly honest. Yeah, watching bureaucracy fail when it's not actually directly affecting you beyond what you already know it's going to do, yeah, I mean, it is kind of a good popcorn event. Sir Liv Drakinefeld, what is your favourite historical topic not related to naval history? Medieval history. That's why I do 14th century medieval reenactment. I'm a very history-oriented person. So yeah, medieval history. Probably then closely followed up by ancient history, i.e. pre-500 BC. That's probably my next favourite area. Yeah, but I do love myself my medieval history. At some point on a fun Friday, I might show you around some of my medieval reenactment collection. There is quite a bit of it. Whether or not YouTube will actually instantly demonetize it the minute I start pulling crossbows and arrows and warhammers and swords and axes out of the screen left, I don't know, but it'd be at least funny to see what happens. Michael Denisic asks, what did opposing navies know about the opposition in the world wars? Were there surprises, or did everyone have an accurate picture of capabilities? Going into the wars, they had a lot more accurate idea of capabilities, but going into World War One, they definitely had a much more accurate picture of capabilities. For a good chunk, so I'm trying to refill the glass at the same time. For a good chunk of pre-World War One, everyone was pretty open about what they were doing. Secrecy only really came in toward the end, so they had a much better general idea. And as the secrecy was kind of being staged in, then they knew less and less. And then during the war, obviously, no one was telling anyone about anything on the other side, so things got very murky. I mean, if you look at the Admiral class battle cruisers, they were designed on what the Royal Navy thought the Mackinson class battle cruisers were capable of, which turned out to be complete overestimation, but it is what it is. Everyone was playing KG Secrets a lot longer pre-World War II. So there's an awful lot more uncertainty about what the capabilities of various ships were. So even for Bismarck, the Royal Navy wasn't exactly sure how much it displaced. They had calculations based on the stated dimensions, but the Germans lied about the stated dimensions, so they were very suspicious about that, and they knew that certain navies were lying. Like when an Italian cruiser ended up in Gibraltar with storm damage, and they measured it, and they're like, yeah, these dimensions are different, and its displacement is different, and you are blatantly lying about it in terms of its capabilities. So, yeah, they knew that was happening, but they couldn't really do much about it. And as far as the Japanese went, I mean, the Japanese went and just hid the entire Yamato class so that people couldn't tell exactly what it is they were building. So, yeah. Well, going into World War II, there was a lot more uncertainty about what everyone could do. The Dying Titan asks, since you're interested in medieval history, I suggest you check out Shadversity. Yeah, I'm already subscribed to him. But, I mean, this is one of the things, one of the many reasons why I started a naval history channel instead of a medieval history channel is because you've got Shadversity, Scalagrim, Matt Easton, all of whom I'm subscribed to. London Longsword Academy, who I, in the dim distant past, I used to train with about a decade ago. They all do good medieval history content already, so why try and add a little bit extra? Oh, and of course Todd's Workshop as well. Very nice chap, actually. But yeah, they're already doing that subject, so I will watch them instead of trying to compete with them. Tracy Stubblefield, how and why are you not a professor of naval history now instead of a civil engineer? Because my day job, up until pretty much now, has been civil engineering and its related fields. This channel's only been going for a few years. Only been going for a few years, he says. About 4 years. So, yeah, I am looking into getting some more qualifications on the naval history side of things, but that's something to look in the future as and when those opportunities possibly become available, and as and when those opportunities can physically be done, given, lockdown and COVID and all that kind of stuff. John Ashley Smith says, I would love to see you do some more gaming related videos. Yeah, as I say, there are games that I play, but I definitely don't want the channel to be overwhelmed with gaming videos. If there's other naval history channels that or naval related channels who are willing to do a collab and happy to host the footage, and then I can collab with them, so that way you can see me doing gaming related videos or general gaming videos, I mean, to be honest, but without kind of diverting away from the main aim thrust of this channel. Then I'm quite happy to work with those who would like to work with me, because I don't quite live and breathe naval history 24/7, shockingly enough. Quickly just opening Steam. So what are my most played games? Age of Empires 2, Battlefleet Gothic Armada and Armada 2, Dishonored 2, Homeworld Remastered Collection, all the Ion frigates, Naval Action, Plague Inc., yeah, Star Trek Online, Total War, various, Atlantic Fleet, Conan Exiles, the Dragon Age series, Mass Effect series, Imperium Galactica 2, critically underappreciated, wonderful game. Runs slightly weirdly in the modern format, but still fantastic game. Good old Imperium Galactica 2. Jedi Fallen Order. Yeah, there's quite a few. The XCOM series. Yeah, if you want to see Drakinifel the Mad Swordsman in XCOM 2 and the expansion for it, but that's not something most of those aren't really suitable for a naval history channel. So as I say, if there's other people out there who run gaming channels who, for whatever bizarre reason, want to see me wander along and give some of those things my best shot, then as long as it doesn't divert my time and attention from producing the regular content for this channel, then I'm happy to do that. Second channel could also be nice. Running one channel is hassle enough. Donald Robertson, please can you wargame us UK USA clash scenario in the 1920s? Oh boy, that's a big one. I'd probably have to wait till lockdown's over so I can get my wargaming group in on it. KK asks, when and how did acoustic torpedoes become a thing? Acoustic homing torpedoes, late war German innovation, at least as practical side of things. Peter Brazier, I've ordered the box set services Dystopia Wars. Yeah, good for you. So make sure you tell War Cradle that I did it. Well, not I did it. That I'm responsible for introducing you. They might be nice to me then. Right. Okay. So I think I'm going to go through some of these copied down questions now, as I am beginning to run low on Iron Brew and voice. So the Legacy asks, could a lucky aim shell penetrating the lower decks and through an exhaust vent smoke out or suffocate crew in the area? Yes, but at the same time, if you manage to get a shell to land in that space and it explodes, you probably killed most people in the vicinity with shrapnel, rather than anything else. CPO fast forward. I'm chief of the ship HMCS Sackville. Ooh. You are therefore a person I want to talk to. Please drop me a line via email or Discord, because I wish to talk to you a lot about this vessel and how I may be able to work my way across to see it. Night Heron Productions. I saw a video on the K-class boats at some point. Were they the worst submarines of all time? Has there ever been another sub whose crush depth was shallower than the sub was long? Oh, the poor old K-class. As long as they're somewhere near the surface, they're okay. But, yeah. The K-class are in a very weird position of their niche exists for about 5 years, which happens to mostly be the 5 years that they weren't in service. They just some of them just about get in at the tail end of when they would have been useful. But really, by the time they're all in service and commissioned by the 20s, the ability for them to be useful had actually passed. That's why they kind of feature in the Battle of the Texel video, because that kind of 1916 to 1920 period is pretty much the only point in history where they would have been of any way, shape or form of any use. Coltex 100, why are you copying questions? Basically because some people are asking super chat questions, so I kind of feel obligated to answer them, but they come up and go so quickly that I'm copying them down so that I don't lose them completely. Michael Wu says, could you show the Lady Drac on camera? That's not my decision. Lady Drac, you're being asked. Could I show you on camera? No. She says no. So there you go. Quite happy to provide voices, but not a visual appearance. That is the single worst description. She's a bit like Langton Cobb in Futurama. Would you appear wearing a giant paper bag?
Yes.
Okay, there you go. So she is in fact Langton Cobb from Futurama. She will appear wearing a gigantic paper bag, but that is it. No, I think she'd be wearing more than a giant paper bag, but that's her condition to appear with a big paper bag on her head. Right, I'm going to shut up now because otherwise I'm going to get into a lot of trouble. A very wise donkey. Will you do a review on the recent Midway movie? Yes, I've already actually done that in coordination with Justin and Military Aviation History. I need to process the audio for that thing. It's very fun. But yeah, I do need to process the audio for that thing and get it out next year. I did want to get it out this winter, this December, but other events overtook. There's such a backlog of Wednesday video content. Eric Thorvald asks, is Mrs. Drac the Sea Mine? Yes, she is. She is the voice of Sea Mine. Edgar Saldivar, will there be another Spring Shop competition be announced? Yes, at some point very soon. If I haven't already done that. And Roger Poker can go away because he's just being a moron. Christopher Riddle, what colour was HMS Dreadnought in 1907? Grey, mostly. She was just this side of the Victorian colour scheme being removed. Right. DKing suggestion, at 300,000 subscribers, dress up like your channel icon. I was mildly disappointed you don't have the same moustache. Oh, getting this moustache to that level of degree could be done. Might take a few months. David Wormuth, ever think of reviewing famous spaces like Scapa Flow or Uthuli? Yeah, again. Things I can actually get, well, without COVID, I can actually go to Scapa Flow. So I'd want to go and do that. And kind of show people around Scapa Flow. Right. Archangel Glenn, I have seen your questions. I've just been copying them down desperately. So I'm using Archangel Glenn's question. Now I'm going to start in on those copied questions because I'm running out of Iron Brew, basically. Assuming crews are equally trained, who would win, HMS Paladin, USS Fletcher, or Yugamo? Yugamo, I think, is going to be bottom of that pile. Let me just check Paladin. Paladin, P-class destroyer. Oh, one of those. Fletcher. Fletcher by a country mile. I think the Fletcher's going to win that one. Packet of birdseed. Your opinion on the Mongolian Navy? Didn't fare very well against Japanese kamikazes back when kamikazes were an actual wind. Benjamin Samuel, it's not Leander, although good spot on it being a Leander class cruiser. It is in fact Achilles at the Battle of River Plate. Right, going now. Let's do quick fire through these questions. Sorry I wasn't able to copy out the names behind these, but if you're still around, hopefully you will remember the questions that you asked. If I was picked instead of Rozhestvensky, what would I have done to make the 2nd Pacific Squadron actually win at Tsushima? Oh, well, that is just a horrible question. If I'm picked before the fleet even sails, I would make a very strenuous effort to try and keep the really old, obsolete 3rd Pacific Squadron ships that were sent after me well away from me. I'd also just, well, because I know to not be afraid of Japanese torpedo boats, at least until I get to Tsushima, I would go via the Suez Canal. That would cut a lot of time off the trip. I mean, the ships are nowhere near as badly foiled up or fouled up, and drum in a lot of training. There's not an awful lot I can do about the shells, to be perfectly honest, but I can probably drill the crew in gunnery even more. I mean, the Russian gunnery wasn't awful, to be perfectly honest, believe it or not. It was a combination of being let down by the shells and their formation. So I'd be drilling everybody very heavily in formation tactics, as well as taking them via the Suez Canal to shorten the voyage. And hopefully that would give me a better fighting chance. Might still not be enough, but given that I'm being ordered by the Tsar, I don't really have much choice but to sail. Because, of course, really the winning move is not to play in this particular case. Did you ever watch Ian McIntosh's Warship TV series from the late 70s? I've seen clips of it floating around on YouTube. But no, I haven't watched. I'm not that old. If World of Warships was realistic, how much more or less would people hate carriers, and what would battleships do to HE spamming cruisers? It would depend. At the lower tech tree, at the lower tiers, say up to tier 6, people would probably just ignore carriers for the most part, especially if you would only get 1 or 2 per game. At the higher tiers, people would be hating them even more. So it'd kind of be a sine wave of hate compared to what it is at the moment. What would battleships do to HE spamming cruisers? Black. Cease to be annoying ship would probably be the response. Yeah. HE spamming cruisers in real life would be basically like taking on a tier 6 battleship with an emerald in World of Warships. What are the obviously many problems with 4-gun turrets, and why did the French and Russians do it anyway? It was the British and the French who did the 4-gun turrets. The main problems with the 4-gun turrets is just sheer complexity and weight compared to other turrets. They save weight overall, but the individual weight is much, much higher for obvious reasons. Obviously, you've got 4 guns, you've got 4 times the number of things to go wrong. They're all trying to operate together, which increases complexity still more. So they're very difficult to get right. And of course, if you lose a single turret, you lose a significantly greater portion of your armament, all other things being equal. So, for example, if you look at Richelieu, Littorio, and Vanguard, Vanguard loses a turret, it's lost 25% of its guns. If Littorio loses a turret, it's lost 33% of its guns. If Richelieu loses a full turret, it's lost 50% of its guns, which is why the French went with, knowing they only had 2 turrets, they went with the kind of, technically were actually two-gun turrets in very close formation in one larger wrapper, to try and address that issue. So, yeah. That was their main response. The British response was, well, have more of them. That's why the King George V was originally supposed to have 3 quadruple turrets, and actually so was North Carolina before they switched for 16s. Because then you're in the same boat as a 3 triple ship that loses a turret. You've lost a third of your armament. Bottle rockets can work underwater. Why not a rocket-powered torpedo? As was answered earlier, the Russians did invent a rocket-powered torpedo. I think the Royal and US Navy's experimented with them. They just didn't put them into service. Someone else asked, I know that the modern Navy isn't quite your forte, but do you think that in modern naval warfare a modern carrier is outdated? I kind of answered that earlier, in that I think they're becoming... They're losing their focus, I think, basically. That... yeah, I think they're losing their focus a little bit, and they need to be refocused to maintain their effectiveness. Sixtus Beckmesser says, I wanted to say thank you for the recent Pearl Harbor vids. My dad was a structural engineer for the Arizona Memorial, and I appreciate hearing your engineering viewpoints. Thank you very much. The Pearl Harbor series was... I wouldn't say it's fun to do. It certainly wasn't fun. It was actually quite taxing going through those accounts, but I definitely did enjoy bringing more light to the efforts on the Pearl Harbor salvage. Box Ghost 102, if the Stalingrads had actually been built, would they have been viable in a Cold War environment? How would they have affected the British-Europeans scrapping their remaining battleships? They probably wouldn't have scrapped their battleships to keep... so yeah, and the Iowas probably would have been kept in commission, which ironically enough probably means the Iowas would go out of service sooner because they'd be worn out sooner. Would they have been viable for the Cold War environment? In the 50s? Maybe into the early 60s? Possibly? Precision weapons have always been a couple of steps behind their manufacturers' advertisements. Especially with the advent of some of the sort of things like the rapid-fire 3-inch anti-aircraft weapons and such. But their viability would have gone down quite quickly. How would the Royal Navy have reacted if the Italians had won a decisive battle in 1940? Badly. It depends what kind of battle and where, and what do you mean by decisive. Do you mean decisive battle as in Mahan style, we have gone out and fought with our entire fleet and won a full-on battle, or do you mean a decisive battle as in we have decisively won this battle, in which case it might be a smaller but very heavily one-sided victory? Yeah, it's going to depend on what kind of decisive battle we're talking about. If it's a big fleet decisive battle, the Royal Navy may, depending on exactly how big it is, may have been forced to either go on completely on the defensive in the Mediterranean, just keeping Alexandria and the Straits of Gibraltar shut to the Italians. If it's a single engagement where a few ships are lost and it's a decisive victory for the Italians, then that might be a slightly different issue. They might be just forced to bring in reinforcements rather than abandon it. Which, I mean, yeah, there are options there at least. Zaraxis asks, what's your opinion on the naval ship in space trope in science fiction so often? As in, do you enjoy it? How realistic do you think it is? Given the size of most of the spaceships in science fiction, it's probably more realistic than treating them as aircraft. And I do quite enjoy it because, hey, naval ship type operations. As to how close that would be to reality, well, that's a completely different question, really. The other thing, Box Ghost 102, with the Stalingrads is that with the Stalingrads, I think it would have also affected the development of weapons, because you can actually see after World War II, as battleships start to go out of service, naval weapons and anti-ship weapons, they start to be orientated much more around taking out the remaining cruisers, destroyers, frigates, etc. that are around. The sort of development of massive anti-armor weapons doesn't quite follow the trend it was following in World War II and immediately thereafter. Um, so that, yeah, that probably would have changed. There would have been more emphasis on those kinds of systems. Jess Stewart, what strategy would have allowed the Japanese to win in the Pacific in World War Two? It would. There isn't one. Basically, there isn't a realistic one. The only real possible outside one would have been somehow persuading them to completely give up their ambitions in China in order to get the US to not blockade them, and then go for Greater Eastern Co-Prosperity Sphere Mark II and horribly leave themselves vulnerable by ignoring the Philippines, because that would have made it very difficult for the Americans to justify getting involved at that point. I'm not sure. Yeah, in the terms of the actual war that they kicked off in the Pacific, there isn't really a way for them to win it that doesn't involve time travel. Big question: if Norfolk and Suffolk did a Taffy 3, would there be a Battle of the Denmark Strait? If by that you mean charge headlong, they kind of were charging headlong to a certain degree. They were shadowing Bismarck and Prince Eugen. At the Battle of the Denmark Strait, they were desperately trying to catch up. It's just Bismarck and Prince Eugen were quick enough that their catch-up speed, their overhauling speed, was very slow. They just about were making it into range just in time for it to not matter. If at an earlier point, say at night, they'd run in and try to launch a torpedo and gun attack, there probably still would have been a Battle of the Denmark Strait, because at least for their first attempt, the German radar still would have been working, and they might have been able to take out or cripple Prince Eugen. I don't think they would have got anywhere close enough to Bismarck to do anything, and it would depend on how much damage Bismarck managed to inflict in return. Kind of at what point does Bismarck's radar get knocked out by its own fire? So there probably still would have been a Battle of Denmark Strait of some description, although exactly how it would have gone, I'm not so sure. Certainly not without looking at it in more detail. Then someone asks, giant superstructure of Doom top hat or Japanese pagoda-style mast top hat? The superstructure of Doom top hat purely because if I did a pagoda-style mast top hat, I'd probably have to put on a chin strap to keep it from falling over, and I'd never make it through a doorway. I'd have to give it its own little cart to wander around with indoors and only wear it in an outdoor environment, at which point I'd probably be struck by lightning because I'd have turned myself into a giant lightning mast. German Channel Dash fleet versus Japanese Navy fleet of the same size. Who would do best? In the Channel Dash or against each other? Because there isn't really an equivalent in the Japanese fleet of the Scharnhorsts. The Japanese have ships of a similar size, like the Nagato, in terms of displacement, and even then not exactly close. But obviously the Japanese battleships that are vaguely in the same ballpark are significantly more heavily armed than the Scharnhorsts. I mean, if it's a versus, the Japanese probably do slightly better on the basis of bigger guns. If it's the Japanese fleet going in instead of the German fleet in the Channel Dash, they probably will. I mean, unless you substitute in two Congos, they're probably going to do worse because they're travelling slower, which gives the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force more time to react. Besides Kamchatka, the worst, most inept ships in naval history. Captain is always a good go-to there. Yeah, I'm gonna have to do a list of those at some point. There's quite a long list. There's also ships that just have really, really, really bad luck. So it's like, where do you draw the line between ships that are legitimately bad and inept, or ships that just have awful luck? Because it's often very difficult to tell the difference. I mean, poor old HMS Berwick has the worst luck of any county-class cruiser, or indeed almost any cruiser of World War II. At Midway, did the deficiencies in Japanese combat air patrol and air defences doom the fleet once they were located by the carrier air groups, or was there anything that Nagumo could have done that might have altered things? Less focus on Midway, more focus on the American carriers, but that would have required Nagumo to be aware that the American carriers were there sooner than he was. I mean, it's very easy to look back in hindsight, but personally, given that there was a risk of the American carriers being there, I would not have committed quite as heavily to taking out Midway with my air groups as Nagumo did. The way the Japanese combat air patrols kind of fixated on certain things didn't help. But given that there was a large element of luck involved in the various American air groups all showing up at once, that kind of factor can't really be accounted for in any kind of plan. Yeah, if there was anything that Nagumo could have done, it would have been more and more aggressive recon, so that he had a better idea that the American carriers were out there earlier, which in turn would have allowed him to, say, hold back aircraft from going after Midway, which could have meant stronger combat air patrol, strike aircraft actually equipped for naval strike and sent off, which would have reduced the impact of any bombs and allowed for somewhat more aircraft to be present in the air as part of the combat air patrol, as well as obviously counter-striking the American carriers, thus reducing the attack power of the second wave that finished off and took out a number of additional Japanese ships. What would it take to bend or warp a battleship barrel? Extreme heat, poor casting, significant impact. Usually a mixture of overheating and or poor casting, or some formula thereof. Great, and now my TV is telling me it's going to turn itself off, so excuse me for a second whilst I tell it not to do that. There we go. Ooh. And then the next question says... Stay. Pronounced as Case Dutch. Will you make a special about the retreat of SMS V69 to Izmuiden in January of 1917? I'll add it to the list. Then all Tegethoff and Ersatz Monarch class, along with the Salamis, versus the Italian World War I dreadnoughts and the South American dreadnoughts for some reason. Crews are all equal skill level, and all ships are the same build quality. That's gonna be the Italian. I think. Oh, I don't know. With the Ersatz Monarchs, assuming the crews are all equal skill level and the ships are all the same build quality. I'd actually be tempted to give it to the Austro-Hungarian side, to be perfectly honest. Largely because it's mostly homogenous in terms of, well, as much as you could ever call the Austro-Hungarian fleet homogenous with its multiplicity of languages, but they are all, at least barring Salamis, from the same fleet. Whereas if you're trying to persuade the Brazilians, Argentines and Chileans to cooperate with each other and the Italians, the Italian fleet at the Battle of Lissa doesn't have anything on the amount of chaos that would cause. So yeah, at that point I'd be tempted to hand it to the Austro-Hungarians with the honorary shout out to the Greeks, purely on the basis that they're much more likely to actually vaguely all be following the same orders and plans, rather than thinking about shooting each other more than anything else. Given the advantage the Allies had with having cracked the Enigma code, do you think the Type 21 U-boats would have any significant effect if they'd been deployed in numbers in early 44? They could have had, assuming that they are, again, functional, as I said before, as opposed to having some of the many issues that they had during the period, then they could have had a certain impact on the war at sea. But to be honest, by 44, even if they'd had the most wildly optimistic impact on things, they're still not going to change the outcome of the war. Even if they have such a ridiculously strong effect that convoys are temporarily suspended, all that's going to mean is that the Soviet flag flies over more of Europe, because the Type 21s can't do anything to stop the Russians. Aerosputnik Jortika asks, why didn't the Soviet Navy shore bombard Finland during the Winter War and the Continuation War? Basically because the Soviet Navy didn't really work that well during that time period. They were kind of coming on a bit of an upswing to get things functional again, but the number of ships that you could actually point to in the Soviet Baltic fleet in the Winter War and Continuation War, and sort of that could do shore bombardment and would actually be properly functional, and by the time obviously the Germans getting involved further south weren't just going to be bombed flat by the Luftwaffe, is very small. So the Russians, given that the Finns obviously have their own coastal defence ships and coastal defence installations, the Russians really can't afford to lose the ships. Mermaid Devil asks, if Plan Z and all the ships for it were built, who would win, H-44 or Yamato, if it's one-on-one? H-44 was never part of Plan Z. H-44 was very much a napkin design. So Yamato would win on the basis of Yamato actually being a plausible ship design, not something that the Germans physically were incapable of building anyway without massively upgrading their infrastructure. And even then, I question whether or not they could actually pull it off. I mean, on paper, in theory, H-44 has certain advantages, but actually, to be honest, even then, Yamato's better protected. H-44 is just massive. But, yeah, even in some wild universe where the H-44 is actually built, I'd still give it to Yamato, because it's a much more sensible and balanced design. Box Ghost 102 asks, Tegetthoffs versus Corbett's, Tegetthoffs versus Britannia's. I would say Tegetthoffs probably beat Corbett's on the grounds that they can legitimately just sit there at a reasonable range of 17,000 yards and just shoot, and there's nothing the Corbett's can do about it. Tegetthoffs versus Britannia's probably give it to the Britannia's, because they can actually return fire and are somewhat more capable. The Thai Navy used to have a landing ship named HTMS Kut, which is Dutch slang for something rather impolite. Are you aware of any ship names that caused great hilarity to the opponents? Oh yeah, there's a few. There's a few over time. At some point I need to put together a video of various amusing ship names. To be honest, most foreign ship names, when, especially in the Age of Sail, when they were captured in the Royal Navy, caused great hilarity by the fact that no one could actually pronounce them properly. So they ended up being given even more salacious nicknames or just being renamed outright. As far as Yeah, as far as other things like that go, yeah, I'd have to put my thoughts together on that and maybe do a list at some point in the future. But yeah, there definitely are some ship names that mean something very noble or brave or nice sounding in their home language and really, really don't in some other languages. Um, what's the best version of the Clemson class destroyers? And what do you think the next destroyer class would look like if the 10-year stop didn't happen? The best version of the Clemson class historically is probably the conversion of some of them to fast attack transports. Because, to be perfectly honest, the Clemson class are fantastic destroyers for the late World War One period, and then they never get a chance to be used in it. And by the time you get to World War Two, they have been somewhat outdated. So their use as fast transports probably makes the best effective use of what the hulls are now capable of, because they're really not up to fleet actions or anti-destroyer work in their base form. Although the version that was fitted with twin guns instead of singles was quite funny as well. What do you think the next destroyer class would look like if the 10-year stop didn't happen? If you're talking about the US, probably something that looks a little bit like an early version of the French contre-torpilleers, because the US Navy in the early 1920s had a very big thing about its fleet screen being fast. That's why the Lexingtons, among other reasons, why the Lexingtons were so poorly protected, and why the Omahas were so flipping quick, and why the Clemsons themselves were actually quite quick as well. They had this obsession with the fleet screen being capable of 35 knots, so the next destroyer class will probably be 35 knots or faster and just bigger and more guns and more torpedoes. So, yeah, like a French contre-torpilleur, except 10 years early. In Harry Turtledove's Southern Victory series, the Confederate Army is using British and French copies. The Confederate Army is using British and French copies of their equipment. With this in mind, what would the Confederate Navy look like, and what would the US Navy look like with a German influence? Well, I don't know about the Southern Victory series by Turtledove. I think you mean, given the context of the second part of the question, I think you mean the Confederates are using copies of British and French equipment. What would the US Navy look like with German influence? Well, at the time of the American Civil War in the 1860s, there's not going to be a lot. Germany or Prussia, and various other states at the time are ordering from other countries, like Britain and France. The US is only really going to have German influence in the 1890s-1900s, and to be perfectly honest, by the 1890s-1900s, at least historically, the US was more than capable of producing their own ship designs. If they weren't, because maybe they're Union, maybe they're a bit further behind. They're gonna, if you've well, at least I think if you've got a Union Confederacy split by that point in time, they're going to be looking at a lot of coastal forces to keep everything running. But yes, it's very difficult to tell, because with this sudden emphasis on coastal forces only, there isn't really an equivalent in the historic timeline. Yeah, that would be a very difficult question to ask without actually having read the series, to be perfectly honest. Hood sent for refit in the US in 1942. Hood returns to service. I now have all the anti-aircraft guns. Yeah, if Hood had gone in for refit in the US, it would come out with 5-inch 38s and 20 and 40 millimeters everywhere, which would have been quite funny. Probably also would have been slightly quicker. Assuming all things were equal, which of the proposed ships would win in a fight between Lion, Montana, and Shenandoah? I think I answered that one, didn't I? Yes, I'm pretty sure I did. What was the most effective type of plane attack in World War II? Dive bomb, torpedo, rocket, or kamikaze for damage, depositioning, and morale? Kamikazes were quite effective against morale, just because of how rabid they were in coming after people. Most effective type of plane attack in World War II. Torpedo strikes individually are more effective at sinking ships because, well, you're letting water in the bottom, not air in the top. But dive bombing attacks are slightly more common, and so if you're looking at numbers of ships damaged, knocked out, sent into retreat, etc., etc., by a given type of attack, the dive bomber is going to probably come out ahead in that respect, because there are just a lot more dive bomb attacks as opposed to torpedo bomber attacks. But yeah, in terms of individual attack effectiveness, the torpedo bomber is significantly more effective. Are there still minefields from the World Wars that have not yet been cleared? And if so, are those mines still dangerous? I don't think there are any major minefields from the World Wars that haven't been cleared, but there are still random individual mines that pop up. And yes, they are dangerous. Some of them are just dangerous in as much as they're a floating or beached lump of explosive that may or may not go off at any given time, and so they need to be safely detonated. There are a few out at sea that technically would still be functional if someone was unlucky enough to run into one. But obviously over time they're becoming less and less dangerous as they start to degrade. If you're in charge of Japanese shipbuilding in 1936 and you could start construction of any ship, what would you build? Carriers, to be honest, if I could guarantee that I'd have the planes and the pilots to fill them, because yeah, if I'm able to exercise hindsight and look at, well, how effective and what are Yamato and Musashi going to actually accomplish, not a lot, versus what do the Japanese really need in the early part of the war to string the conflict out as much as possible, carriers, then yeah, you'd have to start on more carriers. There is a limited number of shipyard spaces, and whether or not you'd win the fight to be actually cancel the Yamatos and build more carriers is a completely different matter. But assuming you can just wave a magic wand and replace Yamato, Musashi, and Shinano on the slipways before they start construction with more Shikakus, then yeah, obviously do that. Why are there so many stories about fuel shortage? Is the fuel not procured with the procurement of the ship? A ship without fuel seems relatively useless. Is there a reason to have a ship without fuel? Yeah, you tend to buy fuel for ships, but ships consume truly colossal amounts of fuel. And you can't procure enough fuel for years worth of combat operations, because one, it would cost an absolute fortune if you bought it all at once, and two, where would you store it? The sheer amount of fuel that warships burn and then obviously have to be refueled and burn again, or refueled and burn again, they go through so much fuel that even the biggest fuel tanks and fuel tank farms wouldn't sustain any significant size fleet for a particularly long time unless you're able to top them up. And then you've actually got to get that fuel out to your ships at sea if they're going to operate anything further than a fixed radius from your particular base. So, yeah, that if someone can cut off your access to the resupply of those fuel stocks, then you are in trouble. That is basically where the fuel shortage comes from, because at least whilst the High Seas Fleet did have issues with poor quality coal, they at least had coal in the First World War because they could source it from Germany. The switch over to oil there are so many advantages to running on oil, but the big disadvantage is that practically nobody of the major combatants outside of the US actually has significant home production of oil. And that's where control of the seas becomes such a major factor. Yeah, you if you don't have control of the seas to get to these overseas fuel areas, oil supply areas, you have a lot of problems. You can do some synthetic production, which the Germans did, but without that synthetic production going into like ridiculous levels of investment ahead of time, you will run out of fuel very, very quickly. And bear in mind, it's not just your ships that are using oil. Your oil products are being used in your tanks, in your supply infrastructure, your logistics infrastructure, your aircraft, etc., etc., etc. If the Kriegsmarine united all of their heavy ships into a single raiding squadron, would that have posed a great threat to the Allies? On paper, yes. In practice, not so much. So on paper, if you put, well, at that point Graf Spee's gone, so if you put Deutschland, Scheer, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Bismarck, Tirpitz, Prince Eugen, Hipper, all into one squadron and sent out on a raiding mission, yeah, that would be a pretty big threat. The problem is that the time when you can do that is really too late. I mean, this assumes a few things. I mean, this assumes that, say, Gneisenau doesn't get hit by a bomb while it's in dry dock and basically completely wrecked. But assuming that that doesn't happen, with Operation Berlin, you've got the two Scharnhorsts and then obviously later on Prince Eugen stuck in Brest, which means that you can't combine them with Bismarck and Tirpitz unless they meet up out at sea. The Deutschland's limited speed will be a bit of an anchor around your ankle when you're heading out, because the Deutschlands in theory offer a significant amount of firepower, but say they're not as fast as any of the other ships. So do you take them and limit your speed to a point you're more easily overtaken by the Royal Navy? Do you leave them behind and thus drop their firepower from your ranks, but you increase your speed? If you don't send out Bismarck and Prince Eugen, you wait for the Channel Dash to get Scharnhorst and Gneisenau back, repair the mine damage, but Gneisenau doesn't get hit by bombs. Once they're all fixed, Tirpitz is in service. You now have the two Scharnhorsts, the two remaining Hippers, the two Bismarcks, and if you want, the two Deutschlands. Now you have a very powerful big raiding squadron. This is very true. The problem is that by the time you actually have all those ships in one place where you can put out a big raiding squadron, it's now well into 1942 at the very earliest, at which point the US has entered the war, and the Royal Navy will have brought in at least Duke of York, and they'll still have Hood around. With that kind of level of threat of German capital ships, they probably won't have sent Prince of Wales and Repulse out. So it would be a much bigger threat in and of itself. But the Allied situation of what kind of capital ships they've got available will also have improved quite significantly, as well as what carriers they've got available. So it will kind of be a force match with force, except that with the US getting involved as well, you've also got the potential of US involvement, be that carriers, cruisers, or indeed battleships. So yeah, it's kind of one of these things. On paper, yes, but realistically, when you can pull it off, it's probably now too late. Whereas, yeah, if you pulled them, sort of magically transported the Scharnhorst over, or maybe you don't do Operation Berlin, and you keep everyone packed in until Tirpitz can sail in, say, the middle of 41, yeah, then that would have been a significant problem. The Royal Navy probably still could have scrambled enough ships to meet them. So King George V, Nelson, maybe not Nelson at that point, King George V, Prince of Wales, Hood, Rodney, maybe Repulse, throw in a few of the older ships as well as backup, lots of cruisers and destroyers. The Royal Navy could have met them force on force, but it would have been a lot more of a dangerous situation than when it's historically plausible. 1939 Royal Australian Navy versus 1945 Royal New Zealand Navy. Who wins the Battle of the Tasman Sea? 39 Australian Navy still has far more heavy capital ships. Well, can't say capital ships. They've got a lot more cruisers. Yeah, the Royal New Zealand Navy has more advanced technology, but they still don't have anything capable of taking on a couple of county class at once, unless it's in the middle of the night. And even then, to be perfectly honest. Had the design A150 class super battleships, aka the Super Yamato's, been built, how would it have changed the Pacific War? Not a tremendous amount, to be perfectly honest, because by the time they're actually built and come into service, the Japanese Navy's already massively on the back foot, and you would have, given how prestigious the Japanese held on to Yamato and Musashi, if they'd got some kind of Super Yamato out, they would have guarded them even more closely until it was too late, like Yamato and Operation Tengo, at which point Admiral Mitchell would have just been like, yes, please come to me, let me show you the superiority of every Hellcat and Avenger and Dauntless, etc., and Helldiver. Yeah. I mean, if they'd had one or more complete in time for Leyte Gulf, that might have persuaded Kurita to press on a little bit more, but it doesn't change all that much, aside from possibly opening up a bit more of a disaster at Leyte Gulf. Assuming the Russians didn't give up on circular warships, would cruiser or battleships sizes ones have a role like coastal bombardment or defense? The problem with circular ships is that they can't go particularly quick. The attempt to make a semicircular higher speed yacht, the Livadavia, something like that, I did a video on it at some point, really kind of illustrated those problems. A larger circular warship, maybe up to pre-World War I cruiser size, might have had a certain amount of a role in coastal operations, yes. But by the time you get to the 1900s, they no longer really have a role, because their design means that their speed is limited to a point that the newer and more powerful ships would quite easily walk over them. And they can't run away. So, yeah. In the ironclad era, when they're not needed, as it turns out, there could be a theoretical role for them, certainly. But by the time the Russians would actually face anybody seriously in naval combat, their time would well and truly have passed on, largely on that speed limitation. In the Age of Sail, how was it learned that the Spanish Armada was on its way, and how did the Dutch and Royal Navy know when to go looking for a fight? So that was a system of effectively reconnaissance ships. The Spanish Armada did not move very quickly. So fast ships could run ahead and report that the Spanish had sailed. You could also get information via land routes, because, again, they didn't sail particularly quickly. So when the Spanish Armada left, the English knew that it was on its way. They didn't know quite where it was until they were spotted just off of Cornwall by a pinnace, if I remember correctly. That pinnace then raced up to tell the English fleet that, yes, the Spanish Armada has arrived. They're basically at the entrance to the channel and they're on their way up. And given their relatively slow speed of advance, that kind of meant that, well, having assembled all the ships, because they knew the Spanish Armada was going to sail along a lot further back than when it actually did sail, the English were then in a position to try and intercept it. Of course, they then had contrary winds, which meant they had to sail after the Armada had bypassed them and kind of play a game of catch-up, which was not necessarily their preferred tactic. But once they had been spotted, and then you had the beacon system as well alerting everyone, the English Channel's not the world's widest stretch of sea, so between all the various ships that were in the English Channel and the fleet obviously then sailing and keeping in contact, they now knew kind of where it was, what it was doing, and what they wanted to do thereafter. And it says, Drac, if you want, I can post links in Discord about the story in the Southern Victory series. One is on YouTube. Sure. Yeah, drop me a direct message in Discord with the link so I can have a look over it. Then Fedadio McDonnell asks, have you seen Binkov's video on Germany, Russia and Italy pairing up to invade Britain during 1945? Do you find that feasible, since by 1945 Britain and the United States would have a massive fleet? I haven't. I haven't seen that, no. That must be some weird alternate timeline, because, I mean, assuming that for some bizarre reason Germany, Russia and Italy all decide to suddenly attack Britain in 45, assuming the historical timeline, well, at that point Italy is mostly under Allied control, so what are they going to do about it? Germany basically doesn't have a fleet left. What was left of it was being tallboyed out of existence in 45. And the Russians have a fleet, but it's mostly submarines and light craft. And yeah, compared to the 1945 Royal Navy plus the US Navy, that would be a hilariously one-sided curb stomp, because you'd have maybe a couple of old refitted Ganguts showing up at best. In terms of capital ships, not that many cruisers left. I'd have to see the video. Where is the point of departure along this timeline? Is it at the beginning of the war, or what? I don't. And how is this playing out? Why is Britain, if there's now a Germany, Russia, Italian alliance, why are they not doing anything about it? Why are they not building up their fleet? How are the Italians getting to the English Channel? I'd have to see the video. Someone would have to link it to me. Although, without some really, really, really far distant point of departure, I'm really not seeing it. Right. I think that's all the copied questions. Tyler Kuhn says, Drac, you missed my question. If I did, I apologise. Please drop me a Discord message or an email, and I will try and get to it next week or Friday, this coming Friday, when I do the Patreon Dry Duck, Patreon Dry Duck live stream, which I'm pretty sure most people know how that works. Jason Hatfield, can I get linked to the Discord? It's in the video description of every video. There's a Discord invite link. If you just do the read more bit on the video description. Right, so that's all the copied questions. Sergeant Sarge, thinking back to a Chieftain video, when do we get to see the Elbonian Naval register from you? I've actually done a few questions on the Elbonian Navy, thanks to Chieftain, in various live streams, actually. I think they're on various live streams. I think if you look at the question timestamps for the people who've been good enough to do those, they are there. Right, Michael Mackenzie. Had General Sewell been unwell or unable to meet or respond to the British envoy, who would have taken over, and how would that change events? Good question. Don't know. Whether it would have been his chief of staff, or whether it would have been another senior officer, maybe one of the captains of Dunkirk or Strasbourg, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, it's difficult to see how it could have gone worse. Yeah, I think I don't know who would have taken over and what their attitudes were, so I'd like to hope it could have gone better. I'd say it would. They'd be very hard pressed to make it go worse, but let's hope it would have just gone somewhat better than it actually did. Majin Von Bogen 12 asks, in the Japanese movie about the Yamato, the first time it takes damage, it shows a PBY Catalina landing close by to rescue a US pilot and taking off. Is it real or fake? PBY Catalinas did come in pretty sharpish to rescue downed US pilots during the attack on Yamato. It didn't happen during the actual attack itself, though. So, yes, the concept of the Catalinas popping down to rescue pilots is a thing that happened during that battle. No, it didn't happen right off of the right next to Yamato as it was being engaged, because Yamato would have turned the thing to mincemeat very, very fast. Calvin Canada, if you're going to do a video on the USS Washington versus Kirishima, yes, early next year, because that's part of the ongoing Guadalcanal series. Jesper Van Manen, are you interested in more ancient naval subjects, Roman or medieval? Yes, I am. There is actually an ancient naval warfare in the Mediterranean video coming up early next year. It was actually recorded much further earlier this year, and I do apologise to the chap who was kind enough to lend his expertise. I haven't managed to get around to editing it and putting it up as a video, but it is coming in the next couple of months. I've made it a priority to edit. Also, incidentally, if anybody out there is or knows of an expert on the Korean Navy, specifically the Korean Navy, shockingly enough, around the era of Admiral Yi, please do get in touch, because I'd love to cooperate with somebody about that, because I know the common history about Admiral Yi and his fight with the Japanese, and he is an awesome admiral, but whilst I have a certain level of expertise in trying to unpick the biases and the she said aspects of 1850s to 1950s and more Western, older naval history, I do know there are contradictory accounts about Admiral Yi's lifetime and how things happened, why they happened, and when they happened. And I don't have the background or expertise to unpick which is which. So if there is someone who is an expert on that subject and they'd want to get in contact and talk with me about it in a one of those interview style Wednesday videos, I'd be more than happy to do that. So yeah, if anyone out there who's listening now is, let me know. If you know someone else who is, let me know who they are. And I'll get to them as soon as I can. JRock3091, I have a question about the downsize of the modern aircraft carrier, i.e. the Liberty class ships the US Marine Corps is fielding. Is it returned to the light CV? It depends what you mean by light CV, because you've got escort carrier, World War II style, you've got escort carriers, which are very small but also much slower and less capable. And then you've got light carriers like the Independence class, Saipan, the Majestics, eventually Colossus, etc. If you're going to look at a light carrier, proportionally wise, you want to start with something like the Japanese Izumo class. That's displacement wise, the Izumo sits at roughly where you'd expect a modern escort carrier to sit. If you're looking at a full-on light fleet carrier, you're probably looking at 50 to 60,000 tons, or there or thereabouts, as a full light fleet carrier, at least in the context of a navy where the Nimitzes and the Fords exist. So yeah, I mean, this is why I'm personally very leery about using things like LHDs or LHAs or LH whatevers as pseudo carriers, because they don't have the speed and they don't have the specialization that even a light CV, but a purpose-built CV, would have. James Cambias, have you ever discussed the Ottoman Navy? In passing, I don't think I've done any specific videos dedicated to them yet, which is probably something of an oversight on my part. I'm pretty sure there's at least one Ottoman ship in the lineup for 5-minute guides for next year, which I need to release probably with next week's 5-minute guide. Vedadio McDonald, here's a link to part 1 of the 3 video. Oh, what the? What's going on? Sorry, he sent me a link. I clicked on the link and yeah, something happened. Memo to self, do not click on YouTube links. Do not click on YouTube links while you're doing a live stream. That's a very bad idea because it takes you out of the stream. Right. Okay, right. Okay, so I've got that Binkov's alternate timeline thing. That's going to take a while to watch. Jerome Rebolido says, I'm not sure, but Kamchatka has an edge over Kamchatka. But if Kamchatka and it sees Kamchatka first, then I say Kamchatka. Someone else has been playing Crusader Kings too. Any plans on doing the Nestroshimi class from Boabok Man? Best wishes from South Africa. Yeah, again, will be added to the list if it's not already on there. That 5-minute guide list is very long. Leifar Ingvarsen asks, what are your thoughts on the Chapayev and Sverdlov class light cruisers? More charitable than they are on the Kirovs. But that's not exactly a high bar to clear. Certainly everyone else seemed to be terrified of the Sverdlovs in the post-World War II environment for some reason. Not necessarily sure that that was entirely justified, but the Chapayevs are all right. They're certainly not they're not what I would choose as good examples of immediate pre-war light cruiser design, but they're not awful. But at some point I've got to do some videos on them, so I will reserve my greater analysis for there. Almost sound a bit like the neutrals from Futurama. I have no particularly strong feelings either way. Nickboy302, if the... I'm going to have to wind this up pretty soon because we're coming up to 10 o'clock, so I think I'll probably cut it off at 10. So apart from anything else, I have an episode of Star Trek Discovery to watch. And see if this episode's any good. Yeah, I'm going to keep my thoughts on Star Trek Discovery to myself until the season is over, at least. Nickboy302, if the 1900s the Admiralty wins the argument that the Dominion should support the Royal Navy instead of founding their own, how does that change the naval defence of the British Empire? That's a very good question. It's going to cause some fairly bad feeling with some of the various dominions who really want their ships under their own flag, and rightly so. On the other hand, if the Royal Navy is able to pool resources and say, right, well, you can, especially in the Pacific, if they're able to say, right, Australia, New Zealand, to a certain extent South Africa, you're all contributing X, Canada's contributing X as well, they might be able to then pool that with some of their own resources and have kind of a a single fleet that covers the area that might be somewhat larger than any of the individual fleets could. So strategically it might work out better. Politically it will probably work out worse. Line X-ray, is that a Rocket Lab pillow? Secret Lab. Very nice chair. I enhanced it with some sheep fleeces. It's nice and warm now as well. Iceman, would you ever be willing to do an episode or series on the uniforms of the Royal Navy? Yeah, if I can find a museum that's got a bunch of them. D.A. Wolfman, what was the absolute worst ship design? Absolute worst. I'm still going to have to go with Captain. Because it fell over. It literally fell over on its own. No enemy ship involvement at all. And unlike some ships that did that, they should have known better. They did know better. The Royal Navy did know better. They didn't want anything to do with it. They were forced to take it. So, yeah, I'm going to have to go with Captain on the basis of it's part of a select few warships that just managed to sink completely due to design flaws and nothing to do with enemy action, but also has one of the least excuses of any of them because, as I say, the Royal Navy could and did know that was probably going to happen, as opposed to some other ships where that happened, like Monitor or Vasa, where there are, to a certain extent, some extenuating circumstances, which we'll especially cover when we get to do the Vasa series of videos in, I think, February. Simpicator asks something. Can you talk about the importance of the Royal Navy contribution to the Korean War and the lessons learned in carrier-ups by the Royal Navy during the war? Oh, that's just the wrong side of 1950. Yeah, it's just the wrong side of 1950 for me to really cover, to be honest. Although I do know one or two people who might be able to talk about that, especially in context of things like the Sea Fury. Stormseer 88, how would you rate the tactical and seamanship skill of Pierre-André du Suffren? I think that's how it's pronounced. He's another person I need to do at some point, a Wednesday video covering it. But for the minute, let's just suffice, given that we are running out of time very quickly, let's just say that there's a reason the French name a lot of ships after him. Thank you very much. JRock 3091. I realise it's not your speciality, but I really haven't heard it compared to an escort carrier. I'm presuming you mean that you're talking about the Izumo. The reason I say that is because if you look at something like an Essex or an Implacable and then divide its displacement by the displacement of a Bogue or some other similar escort carrier, you end up with a ratio, if I remember correctly offhand, of around about 3.5 or 4 to 1. And if you take the displacement of a Nimitz or a Ford and you divide it by about 3.5 or 4, you end up with sort of mid to high 20,000s of tons, which is about the displacement of an Izumo. So it sits there in that kind of approximate gap. And to be honest, if you look at the operating capacity of an Izumo in terms of probably at that point F-35Bs and relative to the aircraft operating capacity of a Nimitz or Ford, and then you look at the aircraft operating capacity of a Bogue versus an Implacable or an Essex, again, the ratios are broadly similar. So, yeah, if you're going to build a modern escort carrier, I would just say use the Izumos as a template. K98, Rock TV. I'd love to see an informative video about World War I, Japanese Navy in European waters. Yep, at some point I will do that. They were around in the Mediterranean in World War I. Fafix 666, Admiral Akbar or Captain Zap Brannigan? Admiral Akbar, because Admiral Akbar's actually good. Yeah. Zap Brannigan's just... He's good to be on Futurama. He's not good to actually be in command of anything serious. JRock 3091. I guess my question had to do with the advancement in technology with VTOL aircraft and the exuberant expense of full-class CV. I know the UK uses the F-35 beyond the Queen Elizabeth. It would be more cost-effective to buy a small CV. Then... Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a whole argument to be had on exactly what size of smaller carrier you should buy and build. It is something we've discussed a few times on bilge pumps. I'll just put it there because we have hit 10 o'clock. Ash and Firebird, did you not see my questions? The fact, if I didn't answer any, then no. But if I did miss questions that you put in, Ashen, then again, please drop me an email or a Discord DM, and I do apologise, and I will try and get those incorporated into this coming Friday's dry dock live stream. So yeah, my apologies, but I'm only human. I can only keep up with so many. Maybe I should have a channel. Maybe I should appoint a channel moderator who can keep up with and tap all the those relevant questions for me. Excuse me. Right. So, it's gone 22:01. The live stream has been going for, according to this, 2 hours and 56 minutes with a slight diversion when I accidentally clicked a YouTube link in a chat when I shouldn't have. But thank you very much, everybody, for listening. If indeed, well, a lot of you still are here. So, obviously, standard dry dock will be coming out tomorrow, and then the last video of the year will be this Wednesday's special, and then we'll see you in the new year with a 5-minute guide on Saturday. Although before that, let me just check. Yes, Friday is the 1st of January. So Friday the 1st of January, so actually the very, very first video of next year will be the Patreon dry dock live stream. So there, yeah. My voice is just this side of intact. So thank you very much, everyone, and thank you to everyone who asked questions. I apologise if I missed your question. There's only so much I can do, but I will try and get to more questions once I've answered the Patreon ones in the Patreon live stream. Okay, thanks very much, everyone, and goodbye.